Hello, dear viewers. Support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it. And also, make sure you comment your thoughts. Now let's start the video. Winterfell 305 AC. Jorah. His cousin was a remarkable girl he'd found, small in stature, young in years, and yet as fierce as any bear their island had ever produced. Be it his father or his aunt or any of her sisters, Lyanna had taken the best of them, and Bear Island was in good hands with her at the helm. That it had been her who'd come to speak to them on behalf of the Northern Lords. Filled in with pride in seeing how his queen spoke to her, and she back even more so. At first things had been awkward between them. His actions he knew shamed his family, and though they were before Lyanna's time, they were not forgotten, and certainly not forgiven. His queen, though, would accept no slight said about him, and she had set Lyanna and the other Northerners right very quickly, telling them that he'd saved her life more than once, and together they'd freed thousands of slaves, that were it not for his loyalty and protection, then she'd not have been in a position to come to the north to aid their king. That she left out his betrayal he welcomed, and knew now that she'd truly forgiven him for it. They were presently walking around Winterfell, Jon Snow off seeing to the stores and the keep itself, Varys off doing whatever spiders do, Targaryen. He felt had done something to incur her displeasure, and so the dwarf was speaking to his brother, and as they walked, he could tell there was something on the queen's mind. He waited until she told him, feeling that she would if it concerned him, and was soon enough proved right. "Sir, what's a northern wedding like?" she asked, as they stopped near the gates. "Simple like the north, your grace. We stand before the old gods and pledge our love and our future to our intended, and ask then, we kneel and ask them to bless the union," he said. "That's it?" she said, smiling. "Aye, as I said, simple." "And this is at night?" she asked. "Usually, your grace." "I had thought it would be more complex. Tyrion showed me books once on the Seven. The ceremony seemed very long and drawn out," she said, and he chuckled. "Which is perhaps why we still follow the old gods in the north," he said, making her laugh too. "I would beg a favor of you, Sir Jorah, though I understand if you cannot," she asked nervously. "Anything, your grace? Would you give me away?" There was a time that even the suggestion of what she was asking would break his heart, and he'd be lying if he said he didn't feel a twinge now too. Jorah knew he loved her, probably had since he first saw her, and certainly had after spending time with her. He'd, however, been forced to look on as she ended up with men not worthy of her. Drogo, who despite her own feelings for the man, was a brute who had hurt her. Jorah cocky sellsword who was not worthy of her time, let alone her heart. Jon Snow, though, was different, much as he hated to admit that to himself. True, he'd been jealous seeing how she looked at him and had thought him also to be unworthy. Even after it was clear that something had occurred between them, he still wasn't sure he deserved her heart. He respected the man and what he did for the North, and had seen how true he was to his people and to his men. Yet he had wondered if he was as true to Daenerys as she deserved a man to be. No longer did he feel that way. He'd seen it with his own eyes after all. The man had turned his back on his lands, his people, and his family for his queen. If that wasn't love, then what was? "Aye, your grace. I'd be honored to," he said, hearing her happy laugh as she hugged him. When he let her go, he saw her smile and move from him, and he thought that perhaps Jon Snow had come into view. Though turning he saw it wasn't the man himself, rather it was his wolf that his queen was so happy to see. Jorah looking on as the queen rubbed the direwolf as if it was a pup, and not a great mythical beast. When Grey Worm, Sir Davos, Arya Stark, and Missandei soon followed, he was happy to see them, his queen even more so as she moved quickly to her friend. "Sir Jorah, will you see the Unsullied are settled?" the queen said as she and Missandei walked away, both of them chatting excitedly to each other. "Jorah the Andal, this one is glad to see you once more," Grey Worm said, and Jorah smiled. "You too, Grey Worm." "Sir Jorah, have you seen Jon?" Arya asked, and Jorah told her where he thought the man was, watching as Davos nodded before following after the girl. They were still standing there a while later, when he heard men march outside and then saw Jon Snow walk his way. The man moving determinedly and alone as he walked towards them both. Jareds could see the man looked excited, and when he looked to the gate he saw why. The mountain clans had arrived. Jon walking over to greet what looked to him to be the Wall and the Nori, both men grasping him by the arm and seeming to be as happy to see him as he was them. Winterfell 305 AC. Aegon. How she kept her cool when speaking to the Kingslayer he didn't know. Had he not already decided to use the man to find out more about his father and grandmother, then he wouldn't have been able to. Hearing from others about betrayal was one thing. Hearing it from the brother of the woman who had committed that betrayal quite another. Yet Dany had listened and then dealt with him without losing her temper once. Yet compared to how she had dealt with him in the trial itself, it was nothing. In private, she was impressive. In public, she was majestic. She had left the room in no doubt that Sansa's sense was petty and ill-advised. That despite her own feelings, even though she'd not brought her father up once, she was the bigger person. The situation they faced far more important than any personal revenge. As they left the hall, he almost pushed her into the nearest room. Jeremy looking at him shocked until he kissed her deeply. "I want to take you now," he said, kissing her neck. "Was it not up to me to dress myself after? I'd welcome it," she said, and he basically growled his disappointment. "You really are a wolf at times, aren't you?" "I'm a dragon, my queen, just like you," he said, smiling back at her when she kissed him and looked into his eyes. "You are, my love." Later when Jot came, she said she wished to explore the keep, the walls and the grounds, and though he wished nothing more than to join her, he knew he could not. Instead, he had his own work to do, and first things first was to deal with a traitor. He walked to the maester's rooms and found the man inside. Wolkin was nervous, and certainly no upgrade on Luwin. Though he and the former maester didn't spend a lot of time together, he'd have welcomed the man's counsel now. Though perhaps it was for the best, as maybe he'd be too loyal to House Stark for what Aegon needed. "I wish you to send this to Deepwood Motti, maester," he said, handing him the piece of parchment. Wolkin looking it over. "My lord, Lord Glover is already on his way here." "He is?" he asked, surprised. "Aye, Quace. Lady Sansa sent a raven after her coronation. We received one in reply from Lord Glover saying they were en route." "Did she now? That's good to know, master. When did the raven come?" "A little over a week ago, my lord." "Very good. The note, maester, and no one is to be told of this. Am I understood?" "You are my lord," Wolkin said, handing him back the note. Burning it on the nearby candle, Aegon left the room and did his own tour of the keep, smiling at the thoughts that Daneseas would surely be more fun. He checked the stores to find that Sansa had actually done a decent job, though she was far too worried about what came next and didn't understand that they needed to actually beat the army of the dead first if they were to have a future. Dany told him that they'd bring in supplies from Ezias, Myrnane, and the Bay of Dragons would help them keep the north fed should they win. So what they had would need to do until then, and he felt it would, depending on how long it took them to defeat the Night King. He checked the armory and was glad to see the dragon glass had been forged well. Knives, arrowheads, and as he was looking at them, he heard the voice behind him. Turning, he readied for the inevitable bump he was about to take. "My little crow," Tormund said, grabbing him and lifting him from his feet. "Put me down, you crazy fucker," he said, the man's smile not leaving his face. "I've missed you, Snow, but my people, where are they?" Tormund asked. "We had to threaten to leave here. Tormund, your people, marched with us, and should be arriving back when the Queen's men do." "The ones with no cocks?" Tormund asked. "Aye, good men, Tormund, fierce." "The Queen really gathered all these men, the horsemen too?" "She did," he said, smiling, and seeing Tormund seem as impressed as he had been when he first saw just how many men she had under her command. "I need to check the yards. Go drink with the horsemen. You'll like them and their mare's milk." "Mare's milk?" Tormund asked, raising his eyebrows. "Like your sour goat's milk." "Only stronger," Aegon said, and saw the eager look on Tormund's face as he left him alone. He continued on his rounds, checking over defenses and seeing what the men were doing. He'd not properly taken over the drilling and assignments for the men yet, leaving it up to Wyman Manderly, who was doing a fine job of keeping them busy. Aegon knew he'd need to begin doing it more himself, and that he'd have to begin naming commanders soon too. Tormund with his own people, and he'd use Jaime Lannister also. The man was a battle commander after all, and while Robb had beaten him at the Whispering Wood, Jaime knew about setting up for a siege, probably even more so than he did. Beric too he could use, as no doubt he had a lord's education and the Stormlords were well known for their martial prowess. They would need to get Winterfell and their men far more ready for the army that came their way, even though he had plans to deal with that army long before then. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Tyrion standing on the south wall with Jaime. The two brothers were happy to be together once more, it seemed, and he knew only one of them would ever turn his way. Tyrion would need to be dealt with, but it had to be done so carefully. He only hoped he could hold his temper when he made a move to do so. That was something that surprised him lately too, his temper. At times in the past, he'd found himself lose it, felt his anger overwhelm him. Usually, though, he kept it on a tight rein. Had he not, then who knows what he'd have said to Lady Stark when he was growing up here. At the wall, though, he'd let it out more than once. Thorne, Rast, to name but two, who'd been on the end of his angry outbursts. Since he'd arrived north, though, he'd found it a harder line to maintain, though only with Tyrion had he not been able to walk that line so far. "My lord, men march from the north." A guard called out, and Aegon nodded before he ran up the stairs and along the battlements to look north. Seeing the mountain clans brought a smile to his face, and he hurried down to welcome them. They'd made excellent time, and he found himself hoping that they'd met with Glover on the way. Reaching the yard, he stood with Ser Jorah Grey Worm and waited until they lords came inside, welcoming them personally and seeing the respectful looks the Wall Little and Nori gave him. In the end, he was unsurprised that Glover wasn't with them. The man was a poor soldier as well as a craven, it seemed. His letter had arrived before Aegon and Dany had even set out to speak to the mountain clans, and yet these men had further to travel and beat him here still. "Jon," he heard Arya call, and he turned to see her and Davos walk his way, his sister seeming different, more relaxed to him. "I'll see your men settled, but while it won't be a feast, winter is coming. After all, I hope you'll all break bread with the Queen and me tonight." "Aye, we will," to Jon. After calling for some men to see them settled, Aegon walked over to his sister, surprised even more to see the smile on her face. Though him telling her that Drogon and Rhaegal were resting and so she'd not get a ride that night did not go down well. Davos asked him who the men were, and then about the Umbers and Karstocks, and so he told him they'd more than likely arrive within the week. Arya asking him then if he had spoken to Sansa. "Since we came back, no, she's kept to herself and hasn't said a word to me or the Queen," he said. "And Bran?" Arya asked. "Is Bran? I'll speak to them both when I have a chance. Will you sit with us later, Dainty and I?" he asked almost nervously. "Aye, I will," she said with a smirk. Yaga once again feeling the need to muss her hair, and this time giving into it, enjoying the slap he got for it, and the way she both leaned into it and moved away at the same time. That night, as they ate in the main hall, he sat quietly watching as Tormund sat with the Dothraki, and Dany and Arya chatted animatedly, that they were speaking at all something he was most grateful for. But he could see there was what looked like genuine interest on Arya's face at what Dany was saying. Wyman and Lyanna sat with the mountain clans, the Lord of White Harbor giving him a pleased nod when he saw them here. Brain sat just staring out at the room, and Tyrion was again with his brother, Missandei, speaking to Varys, and almost everyone seemed pleased, happy to be there. Almost, he thought, as he looked to see Sam sitting there with a sullen look on his face, and Sansa looking lost and alone. When the meal ended and the drinking hadn't gotten too out of hand, he asked Dainty to join him in the crypts, eager to show her the statue of his mother. They, her unsullied guards and ghost, walked from the hall out into the cool night air and into the crypts themselves. The Unsullied under orders to only let Sam inside, as Aegon had noticed him following when they left. He held her hand as he walked past the statues of his uncle Brandon and Rickard, deciding there was no need to tell her about them here tonight. Nor about his other uncle who Aegon could barely look at. Instead, he stood in front of his mother and looked at the stone that he felt did little to capture her at all. "Mother, this is Daenerys. Dany, we're to be wed," he said, and felt Dany grab his hand. "I wish you could have met her mother to see how happy she makes me and how loved I feel." Dany stood there saying nothing, and when Aegon turned to her, he found that she was crying. The tears slowly falling down her cheeks, he reached over and wiped them and took her in his arms, kissing them away as best he could. How long they stood there in silence he didn't know, only that he heard the sound of the fall and knew that Sam had entered. His former friend, not even having the courtesy to wait until Dany left his side. "Dean said, can you give me a moment with Sam?" he said as they walked towards him, Dainty nodding and accepting his soft kiss before walking away. He looked to the ground to see Sam lying there, and despite the urge to just leave him, he bent down and picked him up, looking into his face and seeing it there clearly now. This man was not his friend. He may very well have never been his friend, and what he had come to do now only proved that to be true. "Were you hiding from me?" he asked. "Of course not," Sam said, his voice strained, and in the back of his head the words of a conversation he never had played out once more. He asked him what he was doing here in Winterfell, and if he'd read all the books in the Citadel, and Sam looked at him with puppy dog eyes and a trembling lip. Sam looked like a fat cowardly boy, and Aegon had come to realize that is what he was and what he always would be. Nothing he had gone through had changed Sam, not with him, not with his training. Aegon, Gilly, Little Sam, even killing a White Walker hadn't been able to change him, to change his nature. For the briefest moment, he thought he heard a woman's voice speak softly, barely able to be heard, though he could make out the words. Love is sweet, dearest Ned, but it cannot change a man's nature. Before he had a chance to turn and see who had spoken, though Sam was speaking, his voice trembling as he looked to him. Haven't you heard? Daenerys? She executed my father and brother. They were her prisoners. Sam said, gulping. He said nothing, just looking, seeing clearly just how manipulative Sam was being. He'd waited and watched and knew how he felt, and he'd come to drive a wedge between them. His need for vengeance trumping everything else, but then Sam's needs always did. Sam wanted a friend and a protector, and so he'd become his friend. Sam wished to be free from Thorne's bullying, and so he'd proposed him to be Lord Commander. Sam wanted to be with Gilly, and so he'd suggested becoming a maester. Sam's needs, Sam's wants, never his. He'd welcomed being named Lord Commander, but he'd not wanted it. Would you have done it? Sam asked. I've executed men who've disobeyed me, he said. You've also spared men, thousands of wildlings when they refused to kneel. Sam said an X and shook his head. The depths the man he'd once thought his closest friend would go to, knowing bounds, it would seem. I did. But then those were men who'd never knelt. I took Yancyardsling's head for refusing an order. You want to know what I'd have done? Truly? He said. Aye, Sam said. Your father was a traitor, Sam. No better than a damn Bolton, he said to a shocked look. What this shocks you? Surprises you? What else do you call a man who marches on his lieges home? He went. How many times did you sep Woodhouse, Tyrell? Except guest right under their roof. How many, Sam? Your father was sworn to House Targaryen and to House Tyrell for hundreds of years. Salmon faced with a Targaryen queen, he refused to kneel. This after marching and seeing the end of House Tyrell. Spare him, your father got off lucky, Sam. Had I been there, I'd have dragged him to the nearest heart tree and given his entrails to the old gods. For that's what traitors deserve, he said angrily. Jon, my brother, was given the same chance, the same option as your father. They were told to kneel to the rightful queen and refused. Offered the chance to keep their lands and their heads and refused. Even after what they'd done, Daenerys was far more merciful to them than I would have been, Sam. Far more merciful. She's not the rightful ruler, you are. You're the king of the Seven Kingdoms, Jon. He moved quickly, his hand grabbing Sam by the neck, the sound of him hitting the wall, and the pained groan that came from Sam almost pleasing him. Though it was the fear in his eyes that he enjoyed the most. Fear was good, and cowards were always afraid. Finish your fucking words, he said, relaxing his hands so Sam could breathe, and then waiting for him to catch a breath. He listened as Sam told him who his mother and father were, and how he was the rightful king. Even going so far as to say that he'd given up his crown to save his people, and asking would Dany do the same. The fucking nerve of him, this coward who'd come down here to tell him something that would change his life so drastically, something he knew he'd always wished to know, and couldn't even do that without first looking to gain from it. I used to think you a friend, my closest friend. I am your friend, Jon. No, you're nothing to me, Sam, just as I've always been to you. You actually used to tell me I know nothing, and people like you, Sam, you used that against me, not to help me, but so you could get what you want, and now you come and speak to me of my mother. Here in this place, you speak to me about the one thing I've wanted to know all my life, and even that you try and manipulate me with. Jon, You what? That wasn't your intent? You didn't mean it? You're not here to ask me to go against Dany because you're pissed that she killed your worthless father and useless brother. He looked as Sam gasped, and even his pained look he could see now was a manipulation, a tool used to gain sympathy from him, and one which had worked on him for far too long. You forget the stories you told me of what your father did, Sam. I don't. I remember them all. Your father was a horrible man, an oathbreaker and a traitor, and he died a traitor's death, as did your brother. Sam went to speak, but Dany raised his hand so fast that he flinched and shut up. Not that he had any intent to hit him. So you listen, and listen well. Breathe one word of this to anyone else. Sam and I'll give you a traitor's death. You, Gilly, little Sam, all of you. I'll make you watch as I take them from you. I'll have you tied down as I fly Rhaegal to Hornhill and turn it into Harrenhal. Then, and only then, will I take your head. Leave Sam, take Gilly and ride south, and do so quickly as next time I see you, I'll not look upon you as kindly as I am right now. Jon, please. Run, Sam. Run for your fucking life, and remember what I said. One word, and I'll end my days killing everyone you fucking care about. He smelt rather than heard the piss, as Sam soiled himself, looking on as he ran from the crypts and as Aegon turned. She came out of the darkness, her silver hair shining in the dim light. Aegon, she said softly. Dane, he said, taking her in his arms. Winterfell 305 AC. Rosier, he promised to take her on a ride, and she was happy to see he was doing just that. The early morning breeze was chilly, and yet she felt no cold as they walked to the dragons. That it was just the two of them was something she welcomed, though she was starting to feel ashamed at how wrong she'd been about Daenerys. On the journey back with her people, she'd done as he had asked her. She'd spoken to them and listened as they told tales of the lives they'd had before and after being freed. Arya had seen little of slavery in Essos, Braavos, being a place where it was outlawed, but she'd heard enough to know it was one of the few cities where that was the case. Missandei had proved to be the source of most of her information, the woman only too keen to praise her queen. At first, Arya had thought her to be just like one of the Red Priests, or even those at the House of Black and White, devoted and looking past any faults their devotion didn't accept, but the more time she'd spent with her, the more she began to realize that wasn't the case. It was those seeing Ghost with the woman that had perhaps truly won her over. Davos telling her that Missandei was the queen's closest friend, and knowing then her brother's wolf had chosen to protect her. She remembered Nymeria and something Jon had said to her years before, how the wolves knew more than they. Ghost had known how Jon felt about Daenerys, that was true. But he also had decided to help. He had done so because he felt these people worthy, and if he did, then surely she could too. And I thought I was the silent, broody one, Jon said, and she glared at him before smiling. You've been less broody lately. I thought I'd give it a go, she said to a chuckle. Come, Rhaegal is keen to fly, Jon said, and she looked up to see the green dragon looking at her brother eagerly, almost happily. Jon helped her up, and soon they were in the air, Arya finding herself laughing as she looked down on the ground far below them. They flew north and over the King's Road and then east, looking down to see people heading to Winterfell. Jon pointing out the Karstucks, and then the Umbers. The further north they flew made it seem as if her brother was looking for something, and when he didn't find it, the flight seemed to become much different. Where at first Jon looked to be scouting and making sure their people were safe, now the flight seemed to be more for her enjoyment. Rosier flying over keeps and forests, flying so close to the trees that she felt she could reach down and grab a leaf should she wish to. They flew over the White Knife, and then she was laughing once more as they dipped so low that Rosier's wing touched the water, splashing both her and Jon with the spray. They flew west, and Jon took Rosier up so high that the ground beneath them was almost hard to see. The men, or at least she thought they were men, from this high up they looked no bigger than ants, seemed close to Winterfell, and then Jon turned once they passed them, and they flew low once more. Seeing Winterfell as they flew towards it was like nothing she could ever imagine, the walls and the keep itself looking so very different from up here. When they landed, Jon helped her down from Rhaegal's back, and she looked to see him speaking to the dragon, whispering and looking into its eyes as the dragon made a contented sound. After speaking to the dragon, he moved to her, and without warning, she grabbed him in a deep embrace, holding him tightly and thanking him for sharing this with her. Thank you, Jon. Thank you so much, she said as he held her as tightly as she did him. Anytime, little sister, Jon said, and were it not for the sound of horses, then she'd have never let him go. Something's wrong, Jon said, and she looked at him and turned, seeing Davos and Ser Jorah ride their way. That they'd done so at all worried her a little, and Jon seemed far more troubled than she. Rosier wondering if Sansa had done something and then dismissing it from her mind, what was it she could do? Jon, Davos said as they reached them. You need to come quick, Jon. Visitors from the Neck, Gerda said, though he was smiling, which put her at ease. Her brother not so much. Who? Jon asked. My Aunt Mega, Galbart Glover, and Holland Reed, Jorah said. They doubled up on the horses and rode back quickly, Arya making her brother laugh when she said this was a poor substitute for dragons. Once they got back, she saw Lyanna Mormont talking to an older, stocky woman, a gruff-looking man speaking to the Merman Lord, and a small man with green eyes staring at them both as if he was seeing ghosts brought to life. It was Daenerys that Jon went to first, though, and then the others speaking to them and then bidding them inside. The next few days were hectic. Sansa she barely saw, and Jon not at all, her brother not leaving his room, unless it was to welcome the lords who'd arrived. Lord Glover from Deepwood Motu was stunned to see his brother, Alice Karstark, and then finally Ned Umber. It was only when the latter arrived that Jon was seen once more around the yard. Sansa, too, showing her face. Finally, and yet apart from Lord Roose, no one had seemed. Wished her sister's company, she herself included in that, as she was still trying to decide how she felt about Sansa. The line between wishing her dead over Rickon and recognizing that she was her sister still was one she'd not yet figured out which side she fell down on. Tonight, something was going on, and she'd been asked to join Jon and the others at the high table, even Sansa sitting with them, and Bran too. The great hall was full, and as she looked around, she could feel the anticipation build. Something was to happen, and she knew not what it was. She looked to Jon, who seemed relaxed and was holding Daenerys' hand. Sansa wearing her usual expression, which would crack only when one of the lords looked to Jon. "My lords, my ladies, the North has gathered, and soon we'll make ready to fight an army that seeks our end. Jon Snow has done what we bid him do as king, what he said he would do, and has brought us an alliance with Her Grace Daenerys Targaryen. But alliances are built on more than words, and so too shall this one be. Firstly, though, Lord Reed has something to tell us all, words from long ago, thought lost, but not." Waymon Manderly said, and Arya looked on as the small Crandogman stood up. "Many years ago, Lord Yabort Glover and Lady Meg Mormont came to my halls, carrying words written by King Robb, words written in his own hand, and words which finally need to be read." She watched as Howland took out a piece of paper, finding herself both sad and excited to hear her brother's words. "I, Robb Stark, King in the North and King of the Trident, do hereby legitimize my brother Jon Snow and name him a Stark. I name him my heir to all I hold, above any and all, and remove my sister Sansa Lannister from any and all lines of succession. The North must be held by someone of Stark blood, and their claim must be true and good, and I say my brother is the only one who carries our blood and is worthy of the crown. I ask you, the Lord of the North, to accept this as my will and my actions. Should I fall, then I release Jon Stark from any vows sworn to the Night's Watch, and to my brother I say this. You were my brother from the day you were born, and no man had a better one than I. Leave the North in your hands, brother. There is no one better or more suited to be its king than you. Signed, Robb Stark. Witnessed, Maggie Mormont, Gowbort Glover, Jon Umber, Jason Mallister, Edmure Tully, Catelyn Stark." She heard the gasp around the room, none louder than Sansa's, who looked to be on the verge of tears. She looked to Jon, who seemed to be sitting there with a sad expression on his face. Robb's words clearly affecting him. "My lords, you've all heard the words," Howland Reed said as he drew his sword. "I name Jon Stark the King in the North," he said, kneeling. "The King in the North," Megan Mormont said, as she and her daughter drew swords and knelt. "The King in the North," Galbart Glover said, and Arya looked on as more lords knelt. "The King in the North," Hugo Wool said. "The King in the North," Ned Umber said louder than a boy should. "The King in the North, the King in the North." Arya felt rather than heard herself shouted out, turning to her brother as she took needle out and knelt. Winterfell 3005 AC. Lyanna Mormont. She looked to the woman who sat across from her, a woman she'd not seen in almost 7 years. Lyanna was just past her 6th name day when her mother had marched to war. She'd spent almost 5 years mourning her and her sister's death, supposedly at the Twins, and had been forced to grow up and become the Lady of Bear Island long before her time. To find out now that she lived, that her mother had been alive all these years and had left her alone, Lyanna wasn't sure how to deal with that. That her mother was happy to see her, and upset at leaving her alone had been clear, and since she'd come back, Lyanna had just accepted she was back. She'd been happy with that. Her mother lived, she wasn't alone, other than her cousin, and so she'd welcomed her, cried, hugged her, and together they'd seen a king crowned. But they'd not resolved their issues, and each moment she spent with her, she felt the urge to scream, to rant and rave and call her out for leaving her alone, and that urge was growing. "I'm sorry, Lyanna. I know it's not what you wish to hear, nor that it'll ever be enough, but I truly am," her mother said, bringing her from her thoughts. "Why?" she asked simply. "At first I was broken. Daisy's death, hearing what they had done to King Robb, all of it left me broken. So much so that I didn't know if I'd ever fix myself." Her mother said, her voice so unlike when she'd spoken in the hall, as she talked to men who'd not seen her for years. "I don't understand," she said, and she looked to see her mother's expression, and never had she seen such pain on anyone's face before. It took a few moments for Mage to speak, almost as if she was willing herself to do so. To Lyanna it looked as if she was forcing herself to bring thoughts she'd long since buried to the surface. So long did the silence go on that Lyanna almost reached out to touch her mother's hand. Something she had found she longed to do ever since she'd returned from the dead. There were times when she felt the need to touch her, to see that she was real, and she would need to catch herself lest she did so. Something she did once again. "Daisy was everything to me. She and you were my future." "Do you remember your sister?" Mage asked. "Aye," Lyanna said, a soft smile on her face as she did so. Her sister was her hero, more so than even her mother. It was Daisy she wished to be like. Though she knew she'd never have her beauty, if she possessed 1 ounce of her ferocity, then she'd feel proud. "When I heard they'd killed her, that while I was far away, my girl was dying alone without me, that she may have been scared in those last few moments. The thoughts that she may have needed her mother more than anything in this world, and I was not there, to hold her hand, to protect her. It was something I couldn't deal with. For years, it was something I couldn't deal with. I needed you, Mother. I was alone, I needed someone to hold my hand," she said angrily. I know, little bear. Gods, I know, though it took me some time to realize it. I wanted revenge, justice for your sister, Jon Snow. Robb had named him king, and when I was ready, I intended to go to him. To you. Once I was ready. When Galbart was ready. Lyanna had never seen her mother cry, and even now, it wasn't crying like she'd seen some women cry. It was something much different. Her mother sobbed, large, heart-wrenching sobs, and Lyanna knew not what to do or what to say. She wasn't used to being comforted, and so she didn't know how to offer comfort, but still, she tried. Getting up from her seat, she walked to her mother and placed her arms around her. She let her cry against her as her mother sat in the chair, and Lyanna stood, and despite the anger she still felt, just feeling her in her arms almost brought her own tears forward. After some time, her mother stopped and seemed to calm down. Lyanna sending for and soon receiving some ale, which her mother drank quickly. When she looked at her again, it seemed as if she'd composed herself enough, and then her mother began to speak once more. "It took a long time to be right, Lyanna. A very long time, and then Howland spoke to us. The old god spoke to us and showed us what the world faced." Lyanna gulped. She'd heard Jon Snow speak of them. Sir Davos and the Wildings too, and yet she, despite believing them all, had hoped they were wrong. To hear her mother mention them worried her greatly. There were only so many times you could attempt to reject what people were telling you, and even though she gave her full faith to the king and believed him, a part of her she knew rejected the idea of dead men walking. "You've seen them?" she asked nervously. "Aye, I've seen them, and I've seen them fall, but only if Jon Snow leads us and only if he and the Dragon Queen are as one." Her mother said, "If they're not," she asked. "Then we're all fucked, Lyanna," her mother said, and despite herself, she smirked. She walked over and reached out her hand, feeling her mother take it in her own, and she stood close beside her. "I'm glad you're here, Mother," she said softly. "Aye, so am I, my little bear," Meg said back. She and her mother spoke on Daisy, Lyanna on her memories of her sister, feeling her mother's regrets and her sadness at the loss of her heir. When she told her how proud she was of the job she had done as the Lady of Bear Island, Lyanna felt her chest swell, her mother's pride fueling her own. Soon they were laughing, Lyanna telling her of the replies she'd sent to Stannis and of her first meeting with Jon Snow. When it came to Jorah, it was a difficult conversation. Lyanna having to explain to her mother about how valued he was by the Queen and what the Queen had said about him to her personally. That her mother then sent for him was a surprise, not just to her, but to him, too. Her cousin soon arriving at the room and entering nervously. "I never thought to see you again, nephew," Meg said, her expression one Lyanna couldn't quite make out. "And I always hoped to see you, Aunt," Jorah said. "Lyanna tells me the Queen thinks highly of you, that you've helped free slaves and saved her life more than once. Do you think this absolves you of your sins?" Mage asked. "Some wrongs can never be righted, Aunt. I know what I've done. I seek no absolution or forgiveness for it. I'm here for the North, for my Queen, and for my King," Jorah said. "And what of family?" Maggie asked. "If they'll have me," Jorah said softly. "Sit, cousin. We have much we need to discuss." Lyanna said, and she saw her cousin's look of relief and her mother's small smile. "Aye, we may need some more ale, though," her mother said, calling on of the guards to fetch them some. She sat looking at them, her cousin telling her tales of her uncle, the old bear, and how highly the king thought of him, her mother telling tales of life on Bear Island and of Lyanna's own first steps. The first time she'd held a mace and throwing away a doll to grab it instead, bringing laughter to all three of them. When her mother raised her mug, Jorah and she did likewise, the three of them looking to each other. Three bears where, until but recently, there had been one. "Here we stand," Meg said, and both she and Jorah repeated it. Lyanna feeling happy to be part of a family once more. Winterfell 305 AC. Howland Reed. Seeing the boy was like being transported to the past. He had his father's eyes, his full lips and cheekbones, and his hair, though a different color. At times he had Rhaegar's mannerisms from what Howland could remember, yet when he smiled his face lit up and he was his mother's son. Looking at the sheer size of the force that he'd managed to bring to bear for the North was a sign too of just how impressive he, and the woman that Howland had found out he was to marry, were. His first glimpse of the Dragon Queen was of this tiny little woman who, by the sheer force of her will, had done the impossible. With nothing but her name and that not something that really carried as much weight as it once did, Daenerys had managed to go from being a girl running for her life to a queen in the blink of an eye. Even Aegon and his sister wives had started off with more when he'd conquered Westeros. Howland knew the stories, sold to a horse lord, and left to die in the desert. She'd instead managed to free slaves, unite the Dothraki, and birth dragons from stone. Then after coming to regain her family's throne, she'd put that all on hold to come to the North's aid, only to find herself unwelcome. It was a testament to the woman's resolve and character that, despite that, she was still here, and to Jon Snow's that he had stood up and backed her completely. Seeing the boy be named king in the North, sitting back as he accepted the cheers and fealty of men who had already unnamed him and tried to shame his queen. Howland was surprised to see Jon sit so comfortably, but then he'd been lucky enough to speak to him before this and find out that both he and his queen were anything but. 2 days earlier, "The king and queen will see you now," Jorah said after making sure he was unarmed. He was led into a room where he found them being anything but kingly and queenly. Jon was sitting beside the Dragon Queen, her hand in his, and he was whispering in her ear and making her laugh. They barely noticed Howland when he walked in, as Daenerys pushed Jon away from herself while Jon pretended to frown before the two laughed once more. Coughing, he brought their attention to his entry, and they turned to look at him. The smiles and joviality gone so quick he had to blink to be sure he'd seen it just moments earlier. "Your Grace," he said to Jon and then turned to Daenerys. "Your Grace," getting a small narrowing of the eyes from the Queen in return. "Lord Reed, Sir Jorah tells me you have news of great import to share," Daenerys said as Jon looked at him with a look he couldn't place. "Indeed, Your Grace, in relation to the King in the North," he said as she bid him sit. "Lord Stark would speak highly of you, Lord Reed, of how you wouldn't be alive if it were not you, of how you were his lealest man." Jon said, though his words weren't spoken with any warmth. "Your Grace," he said with a nod. "Yet, when I marched from the wall, when I faced the Boltons with not enough men and with half the North refusing my call, not once did I hear from you. Lord Reed, not once was your so-called lealness to the Starks in evidence." "Why?" Jon asked. "You are not a Stark, Your Grace," he said, expecting a frown or an angered response from the boy, only to get one instead from the Queen. "So you left your liege house to fend for themselves. Was Lady Stark not a Stark? Was Lord Rickon not? Had you added your forces to my betrothed's, then mayhap he'd not have had watch as Rickon was taken down with an arrow. Is your fealty so dependent on true blood, my lord, or is it like so very many of your countrymen's, fleeting and temporary?" Daenerys said, her anger and disdain clear. He sighed as this was not how he'd wished this meeting to go, and being circumspect with his words as he had been was not helping things. "Would you allow me a moment, Your Graces?" he said, looking to see Jon look to Daenerys, who nodded. He got up and took a knee in front of them both, looking up at them as both sets of eyes stared at him, neither of them as friendly as he'd wished them to be. "I pledge my sword, my life, my fealty to you both, here and now. To each of you, not as king or queen, but as who you are. Truly, I ask that you listen to my tale, and whatever choice you make, once you have, I'll abide by. I promise that nothing that is said in this room will pass my lips but by your leave." He saw the surprised look on Daenerys' face and the much more suspicious one on Jon's, before they both nodded, and he took his seat once more. Lord Stark lost my fealty many years ago, Jon. On the road back from Dorne I found out his true nature, and for that reason, this is the first time I set foot in Winterfell in more than 20 years, he said, seeing the brief moment of panic in Jon's eyes before a darker look promising danger if he said the wrong thing quickly replaced it. You knew my mother, Jon said simply, his eyes focused on him as he awaited his answer. And your father. Aye, and I give you my word, Aegon, no one shall hear it from my lips lest you tell me to speak on it. I swear it on the old gods, I swear it on bronze and iron, on blood and ice, Howland said, as Jon looked to Daenerys, who seemed to nod before she turned to face him. Why have you come here now? Daenerys asked. A number of years ago, my men found a wounded Galbart Glover and a tired Mag Mormont making their way through the neck and brought them to Greywater Watch. They'd been sent on a secret mission in the north by Robb Stark. They were to travel to the Wall and release his brother from his vows, then along with you, your grace, he said, looking to Jon. They were to gather the rest of the might of the north and take back Winterfell, Moat Cailin, Deepwood Motte, and Torrhen's Square from what he had thought were Ironborn. Yet no one ever came to me at Castle Black. No ravens were ever sent, Jon said angrily. No, your grace, Lord Glover was badly wounded, and Lady Mormont wished to have him recover before heading through dangerous lands, and then the news came from the twins. Making the need to release my king even more pressing, I would have thought, Daenerys said, glaring at him. It did and did not, your grace. Lady Mormont took the death of her heir, Dacey, very badly. The news of what happened at the twins itself was devastating, and combined with Lord Glover's injuries, they were in no position to do anything. Time stretched on, and the years passed, and then we received news from the Wall of what happened, he said sadly. And yet, even after I marched you waited. Why, Jon said, ignoring any talk of the mutiny and of his death, and Howland wondered if he'd spoken of it to anyone. I had a vision, your grace. Howland said, seeing the brief flicker of purple in the dark gray eyes that now glared at him. A vision? Daenerys asked. I saw the north fall, your grace. My gods told me and showed me what would happen if I interfered in events before the time was right. I saw an army of dead men sweep everything before them, and nothing, or no one could stand in their way. Not until someone could, he said, looking at them both. And what, now you see the dead men fall? Jon asked. My gods haven't shown me everything. What they have is that together you'll beat back the army and that now we have a chance. I've seen people fall in one vision who are alive in another, your grace. I've seen the north go from being a wasteland to thriving. I ask you not to believe as I do, only to tell you that I do believe, and so I've come. So you'll declare Aegon king, even knowing he's not a Stark? Daenerys asked, and Jon looked to her. Stark blood runs in his veins as much as Targaryen does. He is his mother's son as much as anyone's, but, hey, I've come to name him my king, and I've come to give him this. He reached into his pocket and took out the will, holding it in his hand. What's that? Jon asked. Robb Stark's will, he said softly. He watched as Jon took it gently and as he held it in his hands, looking at it for some time before opening it. Howland could see how his fingers trembled and then the glistening of his eyes as he read the words, a small smile on his face when he reached certain parts before he scowled when he looked at him. All these years you held this, Jon said angrily. It was not the time, your grace. With this I could have united the damn North, and you say it was not the time. Jon snarled, where would you be today, if you had, your grace? Do you think it would have truly made a difference in how things have gone? Rickon, my Bretty, he'd have lived, Jon said, his voice cracking. And the North would have used him against you, your grace. When you headed to treat on Dragonstone, they'd have used him to replace you, and though they may have unnamed a queen, it's harder to unname a king. He'd be alive still. Who cares for more than that? Jon shouted. Mayhap, though I doubt it. Our paths are chosen, your grace. The gods have decided our fate, and we are but men. Who are we to deny them? He was sent from the room by the queen as soon as he'd said that, and he saw that it was perhaps for his own protection. Jon looking at him with a look that made him fear for his safety. It was a day later that he was called back to see the king and queen once more. Jon stood looking out the window when he entered, and Daenerys facing him alone. As soon as he sat down, though, Jon walked over and sat beside the queen, nodding to her to speak, and he could see the boy was angered still. This will names Aegon as Jon Stark, as his brother's heir, and removes Lady Sansa from the line of succession. Yet Aegon is to be named king anyway. Why should we use this will to perpetrate another lie? Daenerys asked, though he doubted she cared for his answer and felt she was asking out of nothing but curiosity. There is a reason his grace has not declared who he is publicly yet. He could. Even now, the Northern Lords would probably name him still, but he has not, and if I were to hazard a guess, then I'd say he worries how some may react to this news, not for his sake, but for your own, your grace. Jon looked to him and Howland shivered. There was ice and fire both in that look. Two sides fighting each other for dominance, and he was glad when ice seemed to win out for now at least. Even was what you say true. It changes nothing in relation to the will itself. Lord Reed, Aegon will be named king, with or without it, will he not? Daenerys asked. Aye, he will, your grace. The will just ensures it. It removes any argument that can be brought up later in terms of Jon's legitimacy to be king. How? It names me brother, which I'm not. It names me a Stark, which I'm not. The only thing it does is tie me into a lie that I care not to be a part of. Jon said, and though his voice was firm, there was no truth in his words. It removes the one person who seeks to challenge you, your grace. It takes away Lady Sansa's legal claim, and politically it leaves her isolated. It adds legitimacy to the bannermen who'd stand for you, the last will of their former king. It gives them the legal right to name you, so. And even with a truth to out at some later date, the words are still from your brother. I not by blood, but by choice. Your grace. Or do you think him any different? Howland caught the small little grin on Daenerys' face and wondered, had they held the same discussion before he entered the room? Had they spent the night discussing what this would mean? Given the small nod from Jon, he believed they had, and the decision was made long before he was called back inside. Very well, Lord Reed. Tonight you may present this will. Daenerys said, and he stood up. One more thing, Lord Reed. You've no doubt by now seen my dragons. I have your grace, he said. Then let me make one thing clear. You know, something about my love that he doesn't wish shared, as of yet. Something that we will share when the time is right. Should you speak of this to anyone, then it won't be me that you answer to. It'll be my children. Do you understand? I do, your grace, he said, nodding, as Jon looked to him. The look in his eyes one of only fire now, and as he left the room he found he'd rather face the dragons than whatever fate that look promised. Now, they had named him king, and he'd accepted it, and immediately preparations were made to hold a wedding in the Godswood. Jon wasting no time to see him and his queen were married in the eyes of the gods. Now though he and others had been called to the great hall, and as he entered he saw Meg speak to her cousin and daughter. Jodera having been reluctantly welcomed back into the fold, he assumed. At the high table he saw Lord Wyman sitting along with Lord Tyrion. Soon enough they were joined by Lord Varys and Sir Davos, and then Lady Arya and Lady Sansa. When Jon entered it was hand in hand with the Dragon Queen. His king leaving no doubt in anyone's mind, not that there was any more, that it was both of them or none of them. They were bid to sit, and then he heard the sound of footsteps as almost 100 of the Queen's Unsullied entered the room and took up positions. Lords looked to each other nervously, and he looked to see Galbart sitting there with a pained expression. My lords, my ladies, I've called you here tonight to deal with a traitor, Jon said, standing up. Winterfell 305 AC. Sansa, she had made a mistake leaving after that mockery of a trial, and had lost face in doing so. But then the trail itself was all about her losing face. Daenerys had basically shown her decisions to be petty and uninformed and not what was best for the North while allowing that man to just walk free. He was a large part of the reason why her family had fallen, and more so why she had suffered. Brienne had told her about the oath he'd sworn to her mother, and though she claimed the Kingslayer had done everything he could to see that oath true, Sansa knew that to be a lie. He had not seen her released after his own, he'd not even seen her protected from the whims of his horror of a son. For all he appeared to be a golden knight, he was anything but. And it was in fact his ugly infant of a brother who'd done more to protect her than the man who'd sworn to her own to see her free. Had it blinded her to the politics of sentencing him to death? She didn't believe it had. He deserved it. And her bannermen would appreciate it, and she deserved that justice did. She not, yet that too had been stolen from her. And then it had been rubbed in her face that she was acting out of pettiness. It was only later that she realized she'd played straight into the Dragon Queen's hands. So later when she sat in the Great Hall while she waited for her birthright to be given to her bastard half-brother once more, she fumed in silence. She resolved to be stoic and to bite her tongue. to resist the urge to stand and shout out at the wrongness of it. Little did she know that she was soon to find herself unable to move, unable to breathe, even as she listened to her brother's words. I, Robb Stark, King in the North and King of the Trident, do hereby legitimize my brother Jon Snow and name him a Stark. I name him my heir to all I hold, above any and all, and remove my sister Sansa Lannister from any and all lines of succession. The North must be held by someone of Stark blood, and their claim must be true and good, and I say, my brother is the only one who carries our blood and is worthy of the crown. The words were burned into her brain, so much so that when she had arrived back at her rooms, trying her best to ignore the sounds of feasting and revelry that was still going on after the naming of a new king, she'd been unable to think of anything else. Stripped, named a Lannister, called untrue and bad, named as unworthy. She'd paced the room before finally collapsing on the bed, and then she had done something she'd sworn that no man would ever force her to do again, she had cried. Her brother had abandoned her as he had done so years earlier, and now from the grave had done so again. Were that the only betrayal, then she would have, perhaps not taken it so much to heart. But her uncle, her mother, both of them, had signed away her birthright as if it was theirs to give away. How could you, uncle? How could you, mother? I was the only one who followed you, mother. The only one who was true, and you abandoned me for him, for the bastard you warned me about. How could you? She sobbed. Her sobs rang around the room and through the night. They brought her back to the girl she had once been before she had taken control of her own life. She was back in the Red Keep, crying after being beaten and humiliated by Joffrey and his minions. Her name was Elaine, and she was a bastard. She cried at her aunt's hateful looks and Petyr's lustful stares and touches. She was in her brother's room, shaking as she heard the footsteps at the door, as the door opened and Ramsay stepped inside. That grin on his face and her tears were no defense to the horrors that were soon to come. It took her some time to compose herself, to gather her thoughts, and to still her tears, and once she did, she cursed them all. Her brother who had lost his crown between a foreign whore's legs, her father whose stupidity had cost her a throne, even her mother who had set events in motion that had denied her being the queen the realm needed. She cursed her bastard half-brother and his own foreign whore for denying her what was rightfully hers. By the time she was done, her resolve was true. Once more, and she knew she needed to change how she played this particular game. But how? What could she do? Being removed from the line of succession was no easy obstacle to overcome, and she had so many in her way. If she was to be safe and free once more, there was no one to rely on but herself, something she had realized many years earlier. Only she could keep herself safe. And to do that, she had to rise. She had to rise high enough so that no man, no woman, no one would ever hold power over her. But her, and yet to be strong, she knew that, for now, she must act weak. Making her way from her room, she walked to Lord Royce's, finding, unsurprisingly, the man to be awake and not to seem enamored with the events that had taken place earlier that night. Stepping inside when he opened the door, she turned to him and saw the look of concern he gave her. With Lord Yen, she'd learned that, unlike with Littlefinger and the promise of what was between her legs that defined his moves, the Lord saw her as a weak little girl who needed protection. She'd played upon his guilt over not coming to her father's aid and his guilt over not stopping Littlefinger from selling her to the Boltons. That the man missed his own daughter helped her greatly too, as he'd seemed to have almost adopted her in Yaxlia's stead. "My lord, forgive me for the lateness of my visit," she said, her voice as soft and vulnerable as she could make it. "There is nothing to forgive, my lady. I find myself most perturbed by these current events. My lord, most perturbed. I had not expected my brother to treat me so harshly." "Nor had I," Jon said sympathetically. "Those words to name me as a Lannister, after I was forced into marriage with such a, she said, crying fake tears. Something else that Cersei had thought her well. "Please, my lady, don't cry," Jon said, his voice full of concern as he handed her his handkerchief. Despite his nature, my lord, I never... When I was taken by Ramsay Bolton, I was a maid," she said, setting the seed in the man's mind. "For true, my lady," Jon said after a few moments of silence, almost as if he was embarrassed to ask her the question, and Sansa hesitated, dabbing her eyes with the handkerchief before she replied, "For true, my lord. Maester Wolkin can attest to it. The Boltons demanded it, you see," she said. And though it was true that she had been a maid and had been examined, it was Ramsay's wish and not his father's that had seen it done. Then your brother's will is invalid, my lady, Jan said excitedly. It is? She asked, confused, though she was anything but. It is. Your naming and removal is based on you being a Lannister by marriage, but without consummation. The marriage is not binding. Yak said, For true? She asked happily, as if he'd given her the world. For true? She stood silent for a few moments, allowing him to process the news and to make the suggestion rather than she. The Knights of the Vale rode for you, my lady. The rest of the Vale would rise for you also. What of my cousin? She asked, and Jan shook his head. Lord Robert may not make it through the winter, my lady. Should he not, then the Vale could be brought to bear, but perhaps there is another way to ensure it, so before then. She breathed deeply, wondering if he dare say what she knew he was thinking. My lord, she prodded after a few moments of silence. Marriage, my lady. Should you wed Lord Robert, then I'm sure the Vale would be entirely yours, and with it, mayhap the North in time too. She strolled from her room early that morning, ready to break her fast, and found Lord Glover alone, angrily attacking a straw dummy. Coughing gently to grab his attention, he turned to face her and gave a small bow, the angry look on his face, one she'd come to recognize from her dealings with the man. My lord, she said, and he did his best to rein in his anger. My lady, he said, and she bristled at that, the title no longer enough or suited to her. I take it you are unhappy with the turn of events, my lord, she asked. Most unhappy. I came here to pledge my fealty to a northern queen, not a dragon whore and her bastard chained wolf. Nor did you expect to see your brother either. I'd wager, she said, and saw his scowl deepen. No, I did not, but he is my liege in blood, and despite my own feelings, I must do as he commands. Rosierd said, Even kneel? She asked. I've knelt once. I can do so again, for now, he said with a small smirk. For now, she said, smiling as he nodded. She found she enjoyed her meal, finishing it far more quickly than usual, both because of her appetite and not wishing to be there when the Dragon Queen and Jon arrived. She spent the rest of the day looking over the maps and houses of the South. She was looking for alliances and options. Marriage wasn't something she had wished for, and yet now it was imperative. Littlefinger had almost wished to whore her out in terms of who she wed, each move bringing him closer to his goal. It now disgusted her, repulsed her, but to do so for herself was her only course of action, and so she looked and planned and tried to remember who and where the best options were. Your presence is required in the Great Hall, Arya said, catching her by surprise. How did you get in here? She asked, seeing her sister smile. You should stop it now, Sansa. Stop what? She asked, worriedly. Your games, I'll warn you once, but Jon won't even give you that. He's let it slide for now, but if you think he doesn't see, then you're as big a fool as you were when we were children. How dare you, she said loudly. I dare because I can, sister. Once. That's all I'll warn you. Once. Arya said as she turned and walked away. Had she not already known it, then, this would make it clear. She was alone here. Jon had stolen it all from her, Winterfell, her crown, her family, everything. She straightened her shoulders and breathed deeply before leaving the room. As she walked, she knew how she looked. Every inch the proper lady, the perfect image of her mother, and though it made her proud that she was seen that way, the comparison to her mother was a poor one. Her mother had failed the great game. She had been stupid, and it cost her everything. Sansa was not her mother. She entered the great hall and took her seat, waiting for the others to take their places, and bristling at been kept waiting by Jon and his queen. When they entered, they were holding hands and speaking to each other, how they felt, clear to all with eyes to see. It bothered her greatly, both that she had never known what it felt to have someone look at her that way, and that Jon was so stupid to believe in the false smiles the dragon shot his. After they took their seats, she watched as the Unsullied began to fill the room. The lords of the north looking on nervously when Jon stood up and looked out at them all. My lords, I've called you here tonight to deal with a traitor, Jon said. And she gulped and felt her breath hitch in her throat. Winterfell, 305 AC. Aegon. He was shocked at the reappearance of Max Mormont and Galbart Glover. For the former, because he knew what it would mean to Lyanna, finding out that her mother lived, and though he felt a little envious, he was happy for the little bear too. For the latter, it was because it gave him someone to deal with other than his idiot of a brother, not that he'd be dealing with him for much longer. Howland Reed's appearance was more problematic, and that the man knew the truth, an even larger issue than the will he bore. What are we to do about this, Aegon? Dany asked. Do you believe him? He asked. Do you? She asked him back. I think the man has held this secret for more than 20 years. He's gone so far as to hide away rather than speak on it. I think he can be trusted to keep it a secret still. And if he's not, Dany asked, then we'll end him and his house, he said, seeing her nod. They had talked about the will itself, and Dany had said that if he wished he could deny it, he could have it held back or just make it disappear. He was being crowned anyway, and didn't need the will, but there was more to it than that. Or just for what it did to Cersei, he'd have seen it read aloud. Just to see her face, when she realized that Robb thought more of him than he did her, would have brought him some comfort. But it was the added layer of protection it afforded Dany that won the day for him. So he'd accepted it and had watched as Dany had threatened Howland Reed, feeling almost excited by the way she stood up for him. My fierce little dragon, he said, kissing her when Howland left the room. You are mine again. Anyone who dares put you at risk will feel my wrath, she said, biting his neck. As they will mine should they threaten you, my love. After he'd been named king, they'd celebrated with the lords, the mountain clans, seeming to get along with Dany's Dothraki, even more, once they'd seen Dany drinking the mare's milk. The wool coughing and spluttering while Dany drank it down, as if it was water, only furthering her in their estimation. He'd watched as Dany and Miss and Dany had spoken in hushed whispers, both of them laughing at something the other had said, and he had felt something click inside of himself when Ardia joined in. His little sister was full of mischief and good humor as she spoke to them both, and the girl she had once been was now even more on display. He'd spoken to Jorah, who was nervous about his aunt and the Grey Worm, who for once was off duty. Or as off-duty as the man ever was. That Tormund had managed to drag him to his table to drink with the free folk was not a surprise. That he'd managed to get him to drink some of the awful sour goat's milk was, Come, King Crow, you can't allow your queen to be the only one willing to drink with her people. Aye, but they are her people, Tormund, he said with a soft smile, as he looked to see Dany laugh with the Dothraki. As we are yours, King Crow, Harma said, handing him the horn. Now, as he walked to the great hall, he thought of all of that and felt her eyes on him as he did so. She was happy, joyful, and had been since he'd been crowned. Like him, it was clear she was counting down each day as it took them closer to their wedding. Miss Andy had begun to work on a dress for her, and once it was ready, they'd wed. Edyane finding himself eager for the work to be done. When he felt her take his hand, his smile appeared in an instant, and he wondered how he'd managed to deny himself this for so long. What are you thinking of so seriously? She asked him as they walked. A wedding, my love, he said, kissing her hand. Miss Yende says the dress will be ready on the morrow, she said, and he stopped to look at her to see if she was jesting. For true? He asked, and she nodded, giggling when he grabbed her and lifted her off her feet. I take it this pleases you, she said playfully. Very much so, the morrow, he asked, and she nodded as he kissed her. He was still smiling as they entered the room. Not even seeing Sansa, sitting there, with a sour look on her face, was enough to remove his cheer from his own. It was only once the Unsullied entered and he nodded to Grey Worm that it did. Standing up, he looked around the room at the nervous faces, and found he enjoyed the wary looks they gave him. Fear was good, and they should fear him. They would, before this night was done. He knew or they'd respect him, but either would do and could be useful for what's to come. My lords, I've called you here tonight to deal with a traitor, he said to gasps and worried looks, and he didn't need to look down the table to see that Saints' was one of them. He let the words sit for a few moments as he stared at each of the lords. He glanced at Tyrion, who looked unperturbed, and he wondered if the man really was so casual in his betrayals, or was it that he just didn't consider his acts to be one. Jacelyn Lannister stared at him. The Kingslayer had done so more than once, and he resolved to have him speak to Dany soon on her mother and to find out about his father as well. Lord Robert Glover, step forward and answer the charge, he said, and the lord glared at him, his brother looking to him, and then to Robert when the man refused to move. I said step forward. Nothing, no movement, and it surprised him that the man had the balls to deny him so publicly. Not that it mattered, as at a nod from Aegon. Grey Worm soon had the man in front of him, on his knees rather than his feet, a coward still, he thought as he looked at the man who'd broken his oath more than once. Your Grace, Galbart Glover began, but he shook his head and the man stopped speaking. When I marched from the wall to take back my family's home, we called on many lords. Some answered the call, he said, with a nod to Lyanna Mormont. Some did not, he said, looking to Wyman Manderly, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Which one were you, Lord Glover? I stayed in my home, the home that I'd lost because of supporting the Starks. Robert spat. It was the Starks' fault. The squids invaded, my lord. It was the Starks who took your home from you, he said, with a sneer. Your brother died for the North, my lord, as did many good men, leaving it left with men like you, he said, curling his lip. A poor trade indeed. He saw one or two men nod in agreement. Mormont men, Hornwood men, Mason men who'd fought and bled for him. The free folk who'd lost the most in the battle itself. Looking, he saw even Galbart nod, Magyar more so, and Wyman, Manderley, though he'd not fought in the Battle of the Bastards, nodded too, as he had lost more than most in the war in the south. Yet after that battle, you stood in this very hall and proclaimed me your king, and what was it you said again, please enlighten us? Lord Glover, he said, glaring at the man. There was silence until Tormund rose and moved forward, Aegon nodding as his friend began to speak. I did not fight beside you on the field, and I will regret that until my dying day. A man can only admit when he was wrong and ask forgiveness. There will be more fights to come. House Glover will stand behind House Stark, as we have for 1,000 years, and I will stand behind Jon Snow. The king in the north, Tormund said as he smiled at him and glared at Glover before he walked back to his seat. Oy, that were it. Aegon said to some chuckles, You gave up your crown for a foreign whore just like your brother did, Glover said, and Aegon moved quickly. Aegon lifted him up and slamming him down hard on the table was the only noise in the hall. No one else moved, no one saying anything, even his brother hung his head in shame. Say it again, my lord, say it again, and I'll tear your tongue out with my bare hands and feed it back to you. That goes for any of you. Insult my queen once more, and it's my blade you'll face, and that right soon. Is that understood? He saw some men seemed shocked, and yet more were not. The mountain clans, the free folk, Manderley men, and even the Glovers themselves, looking at him with respect. A man who breaks an oath once can be forgiven, as I did once already with Lord Glover in this very room. A man who breaks an oath twice cannot. The sentence for treason is death, my lords. But I am a fair man, and so, Lord Glover, I offer you the right to trial by combat, if you're man enough to accept it, he said loudly, as he let go of the lord and let him rise to his feet. It took a few moments for the lord to ready himself to speak, and once he did, the cockiness and assuredness that he possessed, but couldn't back up, was clear once more. And which of your savages am I to face? Glover said, looking at the Dothraki, the free folk, and the unsullied. This one, he said, pointing to himself, and watching as the man paled. 1 hour, my lord, I'd say your goodbyes now, to those you love now, if I were you. He walked from the great hall with Dainty beside him, and he could see how furious she was. As soon as he entered their room, he found himself face to face with that fury. What are you doing? This wasn't what we agreed, Aegon, she said, her face almost red from holding her anger in. I wish to see him suffer for his insult. I want them all to know what happens, should they speak of you that way. Should they think of you that way, let them fear what I'll do to them, if they even dare it, he said. Axon, you risk too much, she said, her anger having dissipated some. Against Glover, he said with a chuckle. If I do, then we're all done for, Dainty, he said, reaching out to touch her face. I cannot lose you, she said softly as he took her in his arms. Nor I. You, I'd not risk it for either of us. Besides, I have a wedding to attend on the morrow, he said, getting a laugh from her. Promise me you'll take no risks, she said, and he nodded as she kissed him. He stood waiting in the yard and was actually surprised when the man came out to face him. He'd almost expected him to run, but maybe he knew that it would do him no good. Glancing up, he caught a glimpse of red hair and knew Sansa was watching, and he wondered if his sister thought that Glover had a chance. Looking around the yard, he saw Tormund wiggle his eyebrows and nod. Beric looked on with an eager look too. Dany stood with Ser Jorah, Ser Davos, and Arya, his little sister, looking nervous, and Dany determined. Let's do this, he said, as he unsheathed Longclaw. Glover came at him quickly, and he parried easily, catching the man with his forehead and sending him stumbling back. He circled him as the man recovered, and then allowed him to come again, this time sweeping his legs from under him before allowing him to rise back to his feet. The next attack he simply moved out of the way of, Glover's movements seeming almost one-paced to him as he dodged another attack easily. Then he began to attack the man himself, throwing feints that the man fell for easily, thrusts and swings that he could barely parry, and soon he heard the heavy breathing of the older man. The first cut he caught him with was on the shoulder, the second across the thigh. Glover's pained shouts ringing around the yard as Aegon moved in for the kill. But he didn't push the sword in the full way was on purpose. He wanted him to feel the pain for longer than a few moments. and hearing the sword fall to the ground and the man to his knees, he knew it was done. He looked to see Glover holding his stomach where he'd caught him and opened him up. It would take a long time for the man to die, and he saw the pleading look in both his and his brother's face. "The gods have judged your fate, Lord Glover. They've found you guilty of breaking your oath. Admit you guilt and I'll end it clean," he asked. I admit it," Glover said, and Aegon nodded before stepping behind him. He stood behind him and raised the sword, placing the point between Glover's neck and shoulder. Then pushing down diagonally, he pushed it until it came out the man's side before he pulled it free, Glover dead before he'd done so. "Burn the body," he said as he stepped away. He saw Jaime Lannister look to him curiously as he nodded to Dany and walked to the Godswood. Winterfell 305 AC. Daenerys! She had felt nervous when Aegon had fought, even though she had seen him beyond the wall, and both Grey Worm and Crunot had told her that the fight was done before it had begun. Whether it was knowing that he was doing so for her, or that she was so close to being wed, she really couldn't be certain. After he had come back from praying in the Godswood, she had practically ripped his clothes from him. So eager was she to make sure there wasn't another mark on his beautiful body, and to quench the desire and need she had to have him inside her. When he'd slept, she'd stayed awake, looking at his chest as it rose and fell, and reading the letters that he'd taken from Castle Black. She was nervous at the thought that something would go wrong, or would come along to stop them from being married. Even though she knew it was a foolish thought, it was one she couldn't shake, and so she knew she'd not sleep. And in a way, she welcomed it. The time it gave her to read what her granduncle had thought of her, something she'd not had enough of up to now. The letters were just mentions of her in Essos, yet her uncle had written little notes in them, little thoughts and glimpses into how he felt about her. Dany finding herself teary-eyed as she brushed her fingers over the scribbles he'd made. A Targaryen alone. "I should be with her. Cursed be the gods for taking my eyes and my strength while my kin is alone in the world. Daenerys is the future, the last of us. She must be protected." Her uncle cared for her, even despite the distance between them. Aemon thought of her and wished her safe and well, and though she thought she was alone, she was anything but. She wondered what he'd have done if he knew the truth about the man he thought was Jon Snow. Would he have sent him to her? Would Aegon have come? What would her life have been like if he had? "Dany," she heard Aegon say as he rolled over, and she smiled as she looked down upon him before she placed the letters on the table and snuggled up beside him, feeling his arms wrap around her as she fell to sleep. The little girl ran around the garden, her dark hair trailing behind her and her violet eyes sparkling as the boy chased her. His own hair a bright silver and his eyes gray and dark, and yet it was clear they were siblings, the girl slightly older perhaps. "When you make him stop," the girl's voice called out. "Rosiamin, leave your sister play," a woman's voice replied. "Kepa," she heard the girl call out happily as she ran, and Dane saw the man lift her up and spin her around. His own dark hair, the same shade as the girl's. "Rosiat, gods, I've missed you," Aegon said as he swung her. "Kepa, Munya missed you, too," the girl. "No," Rayat said. "Did she now? Let's see." "Dany, did you miss me?" Rosiern said, holding the girl in his arms, and she watched as the woman, as she walked toward them, as the silver-haired boy, as Aemon ran toward her, and as his father picked him up and swung him too. "I missed you, my love," Dean said, as she moved to be wrapped in 3 pairs of arms. Upon waking, she jumped from the bed and ran to the privy. Quickly she felt her stomach empty and then felt Aegon's hands holding her hair back and softly rubbing her back. Dany, what's wrong?" Aegon asked shakily. "It's nothing. Nerves. I'm well." "Aegon." "Truly," she said as he grabbed her a mug of water, which she drank down. "You're sure the Maester, one of the Dothraki?" he asked worriedly. "I'm sure the wedding, tonight. I'm just nervous," she said, smiling. When he kissed her forehead, thankfully Missandei and then Arya arrived. The girl had begun to spend more time with her since she'd arrived back with Missandei and the others. She laughed as Aegon was shooed from the room, apparently. He shouldn't even have been allowed to stay there the night before. His pout when he was told he'd not be allowed back in until after they had wed was adorable. After breaking her fast and finding that whether it was because she'd just emptied her stomach or that she was truly hungry, she'd emptied both hers and Missandei plates. They began to make ready for the wedding. Missandei had her put on her dress, and then began to make some alterations, while Arya spoke of it being the first true wedding in Winterfell in years. That she didn't consider the abomination her sister had been forced into a wedding was not lost on her. When Dany brought up Sainson, She was pleased to see the frown on Arya's face, a part of her still wary that, should it come to it, the girl would choose her over Aegon. "My sister is a fool, your grace," Arya said. Dany, Arya said, smiling. Once Missandei had finished the alterations to her dress, she tried it on once more, standing in front of the looking glass to see how she looked in it. It was beautiful. The white silk made her hair and eyes stand out, and the designs were ever so subtlety woven in. Missandei had somehow managed to get everything she wished incorporated into the dress. Ghost horses to signify the Dothraki, small spears and shields for the Unsullied, and the dragons, of course. Now you needed to look closely to see the beads she'd used for each of them, all in white so they blended in rather than stood out, took her breath away. After taking it off, they had lunch, and she listened as Arya told tales of Aegon as a boy. The adventures they had got up to and how she'd always find him willing to listen or offer her advice when she asked. It was clear how much she loved him, and that in turn only made Dany keener to get even closer to the girl. When she started speaking of Needle and how no matter where she was, it made her think of her brother, Dany felt herself choke up a little. Viserys had been good to her once, the only blood she'd known, and she still had never been as lucky as Arya was. That the girl knew it, though, was comforting, and she was realizing now why Aegon wished to give her a chance. "My queen, your hair. It's time," Missandei said, and Dany nodded. Arya left them alone, and Missandei began to work on her hair, her friend looking as if she wished to ask her something, and yet staying silent for some time before she finally did. "You are happy, my queen, truly?" Missandei asked. "I am. He makes me happy, Missy." "As you do him, my queen," Missandei said. When she was done, they sat and waited, the moments stretching on and her nerves feeling frayed until she heard the knock on the door and Missandei opened it to let her bear inside. "My queen, you look," Yara said, smiling, unable to finish the sentence for some time before he did. "Beautiful." "Thank you, Sir Jorah. You are ready?" she asked, and he nodded. The walk to the Hodswood was quiet, even though the keep was full of people. She saw them look at her as she walked and felt the difference in how they did now and when she had first arrived here. Then it was with doubt, suspicion, reluctance, and even hatred in some. Now it was, while not love, at least acceptance, and she could work with that. She gasped when she saw the Godswood lanterns hung from the trees, and some people held some in their hands. Her Dosiki looked on eagerly as she passed them, and her Unsullied all turned to face her. When she reached the small pathway that led to the great weirwood, she looked to see the lords of the north, the mountain clans, and the free folk, most looking more than happy to be there, and then she saw Aegon standing in front of the tree. He wore his usual black, and yet she noticed a small glimmer of red in the tie he wore in his hair, a tie that she'd soon pull out of it as she preferred his hair loose and flowing, but she welcomed the symbolism all the same. Sir Davos stood in front of him, waiting for her to give him the nod, and when she did so, his voice boomed around the Godswood. "Who comes before the old gods this night?" Davos said, and she felt a shiver in her chest. "Queen Daenerys of House Targaryen comes here to be wed. A woman grown, true-born, and noble. She comes to beg the blessings of the gods. Who comes to claim her?" "Sarah," Jorah said, his voice firm and loud. "Jon of House Stark, the king in the north. Who gives her?" Aegon said, stepping forward, "Sir Jorah of House Mormont, who is her queen's guard and loyal friend." Jorah said, and Dany squeezed his hand in thanks. "Queen Daenerys, do you take this man?" Davos asked. She stepped forward and saw Aegon's eyes as he looked to her, his own nerves not showing, and when she saw his smile, her own soon appeared. "I take this man," she said firmly, as if she needed to dissuade any who dared to doubt it. She felt Jon take her hand, and then with him she turned facing the tree and took to her knees. Closing her eyes, she prayed for what she wished for more than anything. A life. A future with the man she loved. After a moment, she stood up and heard Davos speak and found herself covered in something warm as a cloak was wrapped around her. Looking down, she was surprised to see the three-headed dragon and the white direwolf entwined. "The gods have spoken and have given their blessing, my lords, my ladies, the king and queen," Davos said, and she heard the lords cheer. Before she knew what had happened, though, she was scooped up in a Jane's arms and felt his lips on hers as he carried her from the Godswood. "My wife," Aegon said softly as he looked at her and kissed her again. "My husband," she said, smiling as they walked past the gate, Ghost escorting them to the great hall for the feast to come. She felt happy, her heart full, and looking at Aegon, she could feel he felt the same. As they entered the hall, she expected to be let down, but he carried her to the high table, and only then did he let her out of his arms. Even once he did, he took her hand in his, and then moved closer to whisper in her ear as the room began to fill. "I am yours and you are mine. Always, Dany." "Always," she said back as she looked into his eyes and saw that the gray was no longer there. That deep purple she had become accustomed to seeing every so often now was the only color she could see. Winterfell 1305 AC. Daenerys. Though it was a poor feast, their winter stocks not allowing them to really have a true one, it was one she enjoyed more than most she could remember. That it was far different than her other wedding was both down to the man beside her and to how she herself felt about being married this time. She wasn't sure if she had ever felt this happy before in her life, and in a small way that frightened her too. Yet for now she dismissed all her fears, and even her hand touching her stomach softly was forgotten about, as she didn't dare hope for that to be true just yet. Aegon too seemed happier than she could remember him being. He had been smiling more freely and more jovial more often than not since they'd spoken of his truth. But comparing that to how he was tonight was comparing night to day. Her husband and gods, even thinking that made her smile, just a little, was even tapping his foot atune as the music rang around the great hall. "Will my husband not ask me to dance?" she said teasingly when she looked down to his feet. "Go, my wife, wish it so?" Aegon asked, and she nodded, her smile beaming at the thoughts of it. He took her hand and led her to the middle of the floor, and while the music played on, it seemed people parted and looked their way. Why she had expected that Aegon wouldn't know how to dance, she didn't know, but he proved her very wrong, and soon she was laughing as freely as others in the hall. They were joined by more and more people, and Dany felt Aegon pull her in even tighter against him, both to protect her a little and to feel her body against his. She thought. Something his hardness, rubbing against her, proved her right on. "My husband is eager to be ad, it would seem," she asked, her voice playful, and yet she almost lost herself looking into the deep purple of his eyes, eager to see his wife removed from such a constrictive dress. Aegon said, touching the material of her dress, and she could see that were she not careful, she'd not be able to wear it again. "Must we stay for long?" she asked as her own desires began to rise. "A little longer, but not much," Aegon said as he kissed her. When they took their seats once again, Dany looked around the room and found herself assessing the looks on people's faces. With the arrival of the mountain clans, she felt that she had gained some good support in the northern camp. Lord Womyn, Lady Lyanna too. She felt appreciated her being here now, as did Lord Reed and the newly arrived Lady Mage. It seemed Dany was very happy to see that Jabra was being treated like family by the other bears. Lord Glover seemed happier with her than with Aegon, though that was understandable given what had occurred with his brother. Arya Stark, the Lady Brienne, and the Jaime Lannister were certainly not her enemies, she felt. Which was more than could be said for Sansa and the lords from the Vale. That she had actually stayed here for the feast was a surprise to her, and to Arya too. She had no doubt, but then her not being here would have not gone down well with the men of the north either. As she looked around, she caught Tyrion looking Aegon's way, and she sighed, the truth now clear in every expression on her hand's face, when he looked at her husband, that he was so bad at schooling his features when it came to Aegon, only proving that she'd not paid him enough attention, something she'd rectify from now on. Aegon would see any threat to her brought down, he'd made that clear, and she had promised herself the same was true for her, with him. If Tyrion proved himself an ally who could put his feelings to one side, then she and he would continue to be friends. If not, then he'd risk waking her own dragon. She looked to see Sir Davos, Aegon's own hand, and resolved to speak more to the man. His own feelings on their union were clear in the smile he gave her when he caught her eye, and it made him another she could count on. "My lords, my ladies," Aegon said, standing up, "my queen and I bid you all enjoy the rest of the night, and we take our leave of you." She smiled as she took his hand, and then more so as he kissed her, to loud cheers before they walked from the great hall. Soon he had her laughing as though he made his intentions clear. He also acted a fool as they walked, and she felt he was both a little drunk and in an extremely good mood. When they reached the corridor which led to their room, she squealed as he lifted her from her feet, laughing as he carried her the rest of the way and into the room itself. "I had thought of doing this from the great hall," he said as they moved to the bed. "Thank the gods you did not. It would not have looked appropriate to be beaten by your wife on our wedding night." She jaked, making him laugh some more. No, my love, it would not, Aegon said, and she shrieked when he threw her up, and she landed on the bed. Aegon, she said, failing to sound annoyed. Daenerys, he replied huskily and moved towards her, while she had half expected him to rip her dress from her. Instead, he was careful, gentle, even as he slowly took it off, kissing each piece of her skin as he exposed it. By the time she was in her small clothes, she could feel how hard her nipples were, and when she squeezed her thighs together, there was more than dampness between her legs. She looked at him standing there fully dressed, and she raised an eyebrow in challenge, one he thankfully accepted. That he then took an age to remove his own clothing was both frustrating and rewarding. Dany finding herself laying back and enjoying the show, and what a show it turned out to be. Aegon knew which parts of him excited her most, and so he made sure to show them off to their best as he took off his clothing. She watched as his firm arse came into view, and then she gasped when he turned and she saw how hard he was for her. Biting her lip, she looked on as his hand stroked his length slowly, her husband drawing it out and making it take an age for his fingers to travel from stem to root. Aegon, she said, her voice making her want clear, and he moved closer to the bed. She felt his hands on her feet, and then looked on as he lifted one of them to his mouth, his lips and his tongue touching her toes before he took them one by one inside. Never had she thought she could feel anything from such an act, and yet, looking at his face, his mouth as he sucked on her toes, Dany felt herself getting warmer and wetter with each one he did. When he began kissing up her legs, she both wished him to hurry and to take his time, shivering when he passed her knees and almost grabbing his hair when he bit her on the inside of her thigh. Dany, he said, his voice almost hoarse, and then she felt him rip her small clothes from her and she gave out an excited gasp. Aegon looked down at her as he kissed her lips and then began to move back down her body. Her torn small clothes discarded on the floor and forgotten about when he took her nipple in his mouth. If she had thought looking at him as he sucked on her toes was exciting, compared to this, it was very much not. Aegon taking his time and drawing more than one moan from her lips before he moved to the other breast and repeated the action. She looked on as he kissed down her belly and felt the strangest sensation when he did so. It felt different, more intimate, and had she not been looking into her eyes, she'd not have noticed. But she swore she saw something there other than lust. There was joy, happiness, and what she felt was resolve. Before suddenly she was gasping as he kissed between her thighs. Aegon, she said loudly, grabbing his hair when he threatened to move away. God's Aegon. The feel of his tongue and then his fingers soon had her on the edge, and when she felt him lift her up slightly, she was lost. It was as if he found a way to reach deeper inside, his fingers brushing a part of her she didn't know existed, and the loud moans she made would ring around the keep, no doubt. Dany found she cared not. If anything, it excited her that people would hear them, that they'd know her husband brought her pleasure. She wanted them to know that they were one, that she was his and he was hers. Aegon, she said as she shuddered. He gave her no respite, and barely had she gotten her breath back when she was tasting herself on his lips and feeling him slide inside of her. Once again, he filled her completely in a way that no one else ever had. Blood of my blood, she thought as she looked at him. That he was getting as much pleasure from this as she was clear from his own sounds, and hearing him say her name as hungrily as she had said his left her with no doubts. It was frenzied, hard, and she enjoyed every thrust. Then it was softer, slower, and yet the pleasure she felt was just the same. Aegon looked deep into her eyes as if he was seeing more of her than anyone ever had before. For the first time, she felt someone was seeing her for truly who she was. Not Daenerys, not the queen, but Dany, his wife, the woman he loved, and she loved him for that as much as anything. Dany. Oh gods, Dany. She felt him getting close, and though she was not, she'd not begrudge him his own pleasure after he had already given her so much this night. When he came, she was surprised to feel her own climax build, and she looked at him almost pleadingly. Where he got the will from to continue, she didn't know, but soon she was screaming his name as she felt the waves come over her. And then she was breathing deeply, laying in his arms content. They slept and woke maybe an hour or so later, and both of them were eager to make love once more. This time even more slowly, enjoying it even more and taking the time to bring each other to the brink more than once. She awoke the next morning to find Aegon had awakened before her, her husband looking down on her as she had slept. Does my husband like the sight I present? She said with a smile, knowing that her hair was disheveled and she bore more than one mark on her body from their night before. My wife is the one sight I find my eyes cannot do without. Aegon said, and she smiled as she kissed him. The sickness came with the food. Dane smelling the warmed bacon and finding herself needing to use the privy. Aegon looking at her nervously once she was done. We need to speak to someone, Dany. You could be... What if someone is doing this to you? He asked, worriedly. She looked at him and shook her head, though she still refused to believe it to be so. She had remembered how she'd felt with Roxo, how she was sensitive to certain smells and tastes, and how some mornings she'd felt well and others not so much. Were it not for her dream then, she'd not think this way, not ever dare to think it could be true. But her dreams came true, and this was one she wished for more than anything. I think I may be with child, she said, biting her lip as she awaited Aegon's reaction. The smile he gave her, though, was far truer than any words. Dany, he said as he held her tightly, and once again his joy was clear. We should speak to one of the Dothraki. They have women, midwives. They have women, she said, looking at him. Seeing how he looked back at her, leaving her in no doubt that not only was he happy, not only did he love her and should they have a child, them too, but he'd strike down any who threatened them, or who threatened their babe. We keep this to ourselves, Dany. Only those you trust, not even Arya. Gods, a babe, our babe, he said happily. We'll find out for certain. I know you won't wish our hopes raised, but we should be hopeful, my love. You should be, he said, and she nodded. She asked Miss Andy to fetch the midwife, and soon she was laying back as the woman examined her. Aegon had sent Tyrion and Varys away, and Grey Worm, Missandei, Conno, and Jorah were the only ones who had any idea of why he'd done so. The Khaleesi carries a child. 2 moons, maybe 3, Larky said. Everything is well? Aegon asked, and Larky nodded. The Khaleesian child are well, healthy. Larky smiled. No one is to know, Kodai, Dany said, and Larky nodded. No one will know until the Khaleesi wills it so, the woman said, and Dany looked to Aegon, who moved closer to her. You, our babe. They are all that matters. I swear it on the old gods and the new. I swear it on fire and blood. Nothing comes before you, Dany. Nothing before you and our babe. You too, Aegon. You are part of us, too, Dany said, and he nodded. Winterfell, 305 AC. Jaime, he stood watching with others as Jon Snow dodged the curved blade. The Dothraki he was facing getting frustrated by the smaller man's quickness. It forced him to move closer and to swing his blows heavier, and Jaime watched as the first one was parried. The second met with a dart forward by Jon, and then the Dothraki was on the ground trying to figure out how he got there. Jon reached his hand out and helped the man back to his feet, and then turned to face one of the Unsullied. Jaxley stood and watched him move, and it was like being back in the Red Keep looking at Rhaegar as he sparred with Arthur. When Brienne asked for a spar after Jon had beaten the Unsullied, Jaime found himself moving even closer, even more, eager to see how he did against someone he himself had experience in fighting. He wasn't the only one watching on with an excited look on their face, as he looked up to see the Queen standing with her translator staring at the two as they raised their swords. Even were it not the quality of the warriors fighting, the fact both wielded Valyrian steel would have garnered interest, and the sound of the two blades clashing was far different from any other. Jaime watched as they sized each other up, circling each other, and almost daring the other to attack. He saw a smile from Jon Snow, which again sent him back in time, and it was all it took for Brienne to make the first move. Where the contest with the Dothraki was, he could see now just a warm-up for Jon Snow. This was anything but. And though he could see the excited looks on the faces of the Northmen, the Wildings, and the Queen's men, there were worried looks too from some. For him, though, it was just watching and enjoying the beauty of two warriors who were good at their craft, more than good. As he watched Jon Snow suddenly switch how he fought, he knew Brienne was done for, and he wondered what it would have been like to have faced the man himself while he was still whole. The fight at first had been just a standard spar, no different than hundreds he or Brienne had taken part in, and Brienne held her own. Then Jon began fighting in a style that Jaime had never seen before, a unique style, and he wondered where he'd learned it. There were spins. He used Brienne's strength against her, and gods was he quick. It was the unorthodox nature of it, though, which won the day. True, he may have beaten her in a standard fight anyway, but in this, she was done the moment he wished it to end. I yield, Rhaenyra said with a smile on her face, as Jon helped her up, and she had barely moved away before another, and then another took her place. By the time his sister faced him, Jon Snow had beaten 6 or maybe 7 men, and yet wasn't even breathing hard. Ymir looked on as the small girl pulled out a thin sword, and once again the smile was back on Jon Snow's face. This fight was a blur, though, and if he thought Jon Snow was quick before then, watching him now made it look as if he had been holding back. Though he needed to be fast as the young girl moved, perhaps even quicker than he did. Watching Jon face Brienne, he had thought his style unique. Seeing his sister fight, he knew hers was, and yet, unlike Brienne with Jon with Arya found him able to change his style to match her own. It wasn't strength nor skill, and it wasn't a technique which won the day for Jon either. It was in the end experience as he laid a trap, and Jaime and the others watched as Arya fell for it. Jon purposely dropping his sword and allowing the girl's hesitancy and surprise to be her downfall. "Yield," Jon said, holding the bone-hilted dagger to Arya's neck, and the girl nodded, laughing loudly. "You fucker. You did that on purpose," she said, and Jaime, like some of the others, chuckled when in return she had her hair mussed, making her laugh even more loudly. With the spars over, he readied to turn and go about some of his own daily routines, only to find Jon Snow looking at him as he drank his water. Whatever doubts he had that he was right, and he had very few now, the deep purple eyes which stared at him proved them false. Jon Snow was Rhaegar Targaryen's son. Jaime was sure of it, and he didn't know what to make of that information. It seemed also as if he was not going to be allowed to be alone with his thoughts, as far too soon Jon Snow moved and was standing in front of him. "Sir Jaime, I believe her grace would like a word," Jon said, and Jaime nodded, trying his best not to stare. He watched as Jon closed his eyes for a moment, and then rather than bring him to the rooms he and the Queen were sharing, Jaime was walked through the courtyard and into the Godswood, finding it empty for once. Soon enough, they were standing in front of the large weirwood, and he turned to face the boy who he now knew was his prince's son. Something that Jon Snow seemed to know too, given how he looked at him. "Ned Stark fooled everyone, Sir Jaime, not just you or your father, Varys, Olenna Tyrell, Robert, he fooled them all." "How long? When?" he asked. "Ned Stark made you all believe he was an honorable man, Sir Jaime, that each thing he did was guided by it, that he believed it, lived it, and practiced it, when in truth, Ned Stark was anything but," Jon said, and Jaime looked at him surprised. He watched as the boy gave a sad chuckle as he sat down and bid him do likewise. Jon then reaching out and taking a cloth and then removing his sword to rub it clean. "I too was brought up on tales of his honor, how he was the most honorable man in Westeros, how I was a stain on that honor, a blight, the one mark on an otherwise pristine cloak," Jon said and snorted, "when in truth I was the proof that the man cared not for honor, not for family either. My uncle was born a wolf, Satraime, and yet he died a stag." The bitterness was not a surprise, and yet it was too. But before he had a chance to ask or to hear any answers to the questions he already had, he heard footsteps and turned to see the Queen and the White Wolf walking his way. He saw the expression on Jon's face change immediately, one he'd only seen rarely on Rhaegar's face, and one he identified more with Rhaenys than with her father. "My Queen," Jon said, laying down his cloak so the Queen could sit and kissing her deeply before she did so. "Jaime here knows the truth, it seems. I think it's time for more truths to be spilled here this day." "Don't you? Tell me of my mother and brother Sir Jaime," the Queen asked, and he swallowed hard. "Of course, your grace. I wasn't as close to Rhaegar as some Sir Dane was his closest friend, and no man knew him better than he. Yet I knew him better than most, and I respected him greatly. Your brother, your father," he said, looking to Jon, "was a good man no matter what they say about him. I don't know why he and your mother, but it was never as they said it was. I'll not nor have I ever believed that. My mother and father loved each other, Sir Jaime. I know the truth of them, of what happened, and why they parted, how they did. I know why my father left 3 good men to see me safe, and how they met their ends at the hands of a man who did anything but." He watched as the Queen took Jon's hand in her own, as she rubbed it softly, and as Jon smiled in return before he looked at him again. "Queen Rhaella?" Jon asked, and this time it was Daenerys who looked at him the most eagerly. "Was one of the sweetest, kindest, truest women I know, and we failed her." Jaime said, his voice almost breaking as he talked about her. "Failed her?" Daenerys asked. "What do you know of your father, your grace?" "Sir Barristan told me the truth of him, of what he did to she said, looking to Jon and unable to give voice to her words, though he didn't need her to, knowing who she was speaking of. He was worse than that. Your Grace. Tell us, Jon said determinedly, and so he did. He told of how the fire excited him, and of what he would do once he was excited. Yamme spoke of Jonathor and what he'd told him as he guarded the door. Soon enough, he was speaking of things he'd barely told anyone, the words just coming from him in a torrent as he told of the reasons why he'd killed Aerys and how he'd failed. Rhaegar and his family. When it got to Aelia and the children, he told how he'd never imagined his father could do such a thing. There had been few times in his life when he'd truly cried, when he'd wept openly, and even fewer that he'd done so with anyone there with him. In the Godswood by the great weirwood, Jaime Lannister wept for some time, even going so far as to get down on his knees and beg them to end him, to make him pay for the crimes of the past, crimes that he had convicted himself of long ago. His failures as a man, as a knight, finally laid out for all to see, finally explained to people who, for the first time in his life, actually did have the right to judge him. Yeah, I failed your mother? I should have acted sooner. I should have. God's reign sees, Aegon, Aelia, I failed them. I didn't know, I thought. I should have known. He said as he wept and couldn't look at them both. There was no response from either of them as he wept, and none when he begged them to judge him guilty. My life is yours to take. I wronged you both. Had I your mother, your father, your brother, sister, Aelia, gods, do it. Please just do it. Rosier asked me to look after his family, to protect them. I failed him. I failed them all. Jaime said, his tears falling as he looked at them both. Today is not your day to die, Sir Jaime, Daenerys said, her voice far softer than he had expected, and yet it was Jon Snow's whose voice surprised him most. In the north, an oath sworn in front of a weirwood is one which our gods hold truest of all. Cursed is the kinslayer, is something every man and woman in Westeros knows. Here in the north, a man who breaks an oath in front of the weirwood is just as cursed. You say my father, my queen's brother, asked you to look after his family. Ser Jaime? Jon asked, his voice calm. It was the last thing he said to me. After Ace, I thought it done. I thought them safe. We're still not safe, Sir Ziak, raved me. Rhaegar's family sits in front of you right now, right here. What will you do to protect them? Jon asked. He looked at him, not sure if he was hearing what he thought he was hearing. Surely he wasn't saying what he believed him to be saying. Yet the look Jon Snow gave him, Daenerys was giving him, proved that he really was being offered a second chance. Anything, he said softly. For now, my queen is all our family. That anyone knows, I'll have your oath, Sir Jaime, here in this place. I'll have it that you'll shield our backs, that you'll guard our secrets, and that you'll give your life in service of ours. He couldn't. How could he know? Kingsguard, you're asking me to be a Kingsguard, he asked, his voice hopeful. A Queen's Guard for now, Sacranier, but I'm asking you to be what you wish to be. What say you? Jon asked. Your Grace, he said, looking to Daenerys, and then to Jon. Aegon. Jon said, and Yaime nodded as he took out his sword. Kneeling in front of them, he looked up at them both. I pledge my sword, my life, my honor to her Grace, Queen Daenerys and his Grace King Aegon of the House Targaryen. I shall shield their backs, guard their secrets, give my life for theirs. I shall hold no king or queen above them, no allegiance to any house or crown but theirs. From this day to my last day. Rise, Sir Jaime, we have much work that needs to be done, Daenerys said. King's Landing 305 AC, the Griffin. It was over 20 years since he had stepped foot in this shit-smelling city, and if anything, time had done him more favors than it had done King's Landing. As he rode with the rest of the company's captains, he saw the looks the people had in their eyes, and he found he couldn't blame them for looking so fearful. There was a huge empty space where the Great Sept had once stood, and these people now lived under another mad ruler. Even if this one didn't have a cock between her legs, she was still a Daenerys reborn. Jon found himself wondering, did Cersei Lannister's desires rise when people burned? For Daenerys would surely have been hard as a rock watching countless people die in the Sept. The thoughts of what she had done, House Tyrell had all been wiped out, countless lords and ladies, even her own uncle, and yet it had made no difference to her. She'd seen it done. Oh, she had since tried to claim that it was her imp brother and the Mad King's daughter, but Lucino had told them the truth. It was Tywin's mad lioness who had blown up the Great Sept, who had then allied with a man just as mad as her too. The Crow's Eye had come damnably close to being killed on their voyage here. That he kept his cruelty to his own men and had only threatened some of theirs was the only reason the one-eyed freak still lived. Mad as he was, Euron Greyjoy knew better than to cross a line with the Golden Company. Strickland may be as weak as piss, but he, Lozyanov, Balak, Trystane, and Lasswell were anything but. Seeing the Red Keep in front of him was a shock to his system, and soon enough he was walking through corridors he'd once strolled through as a far younger man. When he entered the throne room, he half expected to see King Scab sit the throne, and despite himself, his eyes were drawn to the right, as he instinctively looked for his silver prince. You stand in the presence of her grace, Cersei Lannister, the first of her name, Queen of the Andals, Runar and the First Men, Lady of the Seven Kingdoms and Protector of the Realm. A small gray-haired man said, the man wearing a Maester's robe and bearing the pin of the hand, a pin he had worn once, he thought bitterly. My queen? Euron said over-exuberantly, and Jon thought that if the queen bought that, then she may very well be the stupidest of all the Lannisters. Lord Greyjoy, the queen said with a false smile, and he didn't know which of the two was the worst mummer. I bring you the Golden Company, Euron said, and Harry stepped forward. He had to admit, looking at Strickland in his armor and with Blackfire on his hip, you'd think him a worthy leader of the Golden Company, as long as you didn't look too closely, that was. His hair pulled over to cover up where it was balding was a clear enough sign that his appearance was a facade, and other than his elephants, which he'd had to leave behind much to Jon's amusement, Harry commanded no respect. Your Grace, the Golden Company stands ready. 20,000 men, is it? Cersei asked, her false smile still plastered on her face. Yes, Your Grace, Strickland replied. Horses, 2,000. And elephants? Cersei asked, and Jon tried not to snigger. No elephants, Your Grace. That's disappointing. I was told the Golden Company had elephants. Cersei said, her expression changing, and despite the many years since he'd seen it, Jon knew that look. A madman had worn that look once, and what Strickland said next could provoke or assuage a mad queen. He looked around the room. There were a few guards and one giant of one. Yet Jon focused on Euron Greyjoy. If things went to shit, he'd gut that fucker before he met his gods. They are excellent beasts, Your Grace, but not well suited to long sea voyages, Strickland said, and the madness seemed to retreat. For now. In any event, you're more welcome here in King's Landing, Captain Strickland. We look forward to fighting on your behalf, Your Grace, Strickland said, and Jon bristled. Speak for yourself, he thought as they turned and left the Mad Queen and the Mad Pirate to their own devices. It took them almost 3 days to empty the ships, and even longer to find places for all the men to stay. Lozia found them a building that he personally examined and deemed secure. The spider's little birds had a way of finding their way into every nook and cranny, and Jon had taught Loziono well what to expect here in Westeros. There would be spies everywhere. The spider worked with Daenerys Targaryen now and would know what they ate for dinner, and who didn't wear small clothes if they were not careful. Not to mention the Queen's own spies, no doubt watched too. Strickland both bemoaned the fact he didn't have his beloved elephant with him, how a man could have favored big-eared beast was beyond him, and that there was less to spend coin on here than in Essos. While Jon and the others spoke on much more practical things, such as defending the city from dragons and how to defeat Dothraki and Unsullied, neither of whom any of them were keen on facing. Despite his own wish to return home, to see Griffin's Roost once more before he died and to walk in the footsteps of his Silver Prince, Jon had been against this contract. That the company wished to come home was one thing. To actually fight on the side of Lannisters after what they had done, that was something he couldn't stomach. The Golden Company may have been formed to fight against the Red Dragon of House Targaryen, but those days were long gone, and it was gold that truly ruled their wants these days. In the end, he was outvoted, and though he'd considered resigning his commission, he'd nowhere else to go. Jon Connington was a man without a cause. He had been since his Silver Prince died, and since Tywin had set his mad dogs loose in the Red Keep 20 years earlier. It seemed his destiny to fight and die like most of the men of the Golden Company. For gold and not for a cause. I heard a tale from the north, Lozano said, taking his seat at their table. What tale? The Queen and this Jon Snow have arrived in the north leading the largest army the world has ever seen. Jon Dothraki, unsullied, almost 100,000 strong. Lozano said, And Jon saw Balak, Franklin Flowers, and young John Mudd all look nervously at their spymaster. Dragons? Laswell Peak asked. 2, the largest of them, the queen herself rides, Lysano said. And Jon smiled. Rosier had always believed that he was the prince that was promised, that one day he'd wake dragons from stone and lead an army to face the greatest threat the world had ever known. It seems it may have been his sister's and not his destiny to do so. They head for Winterfell? He asked, and Lysano nodded. He couldn't help but be bitter when he thought of the wolves. Ned Stark had risen against his prince, and he and the fat stag had named Rhaegar a kidnapper and a rapist, as if he would ever need to do either. What had happened between him and the wolf girl he knew not, but it was certainly not rape, and yet in the end she had led him to his death. For that alone, he hated the damned Starks and would love to see them fall, though they had liked the stags fallen greatly already. The wall has fallen too, Lysano said, and Jon snorted. The wall has stood for thousands of years, Lysano. Until now, the spymaster said, and Jon took a swallow of his wine as he looked around the room, the faces more nervous now as they remembered the tales Lysano had told them about an army of dead men. He was walking back to where he was staying, when he heard the voice calling him. Turning, he saw Balak run his way. Connington, wait up, damn it, man. Don't make me run after you. I'm not a damn griffin, Balak said, laughing as he caught him. What's wrong, my friend? He asked quietly. This, Jon, all of it, we should not be here, Balak said, and he nodded. I know, but we are. All we can do now is prepare. Is it? Balak asked before he could answer him. Jon saw the small child as he scurried away, the little bird off to sing his song. No doubt, well, if he had doubted it before it was clear now, the spider would soon know the griffin had returned. Winterfell 3005 AC. Howland. He'd spoken to Mage and Galbart about the execution. True, it had been framed as a trial by combat, but it was, in the end, an execution all the same. Mage had welcomed it. Said that it showed that Jon Snow had what it took to be their king, and while Galbart was less effusive in his praise, for obvious reasons, he didn't bear their king any ill will for killing his brother. Rosier's own actions had led to his demise, and he'd shamed House Glover more than once, something that Galbart would never have forgiven him for had he lived. Now, though, they were being called to a meeting, and unlike the one they'd be attending inside, this one was to be held in the Godswood. He, Lord Wyman, the Mormonts, Sir Davos, Shamu Lannister, and the leader of the Free Folk, Tormund Giantsbane, though even they seemed to think Jon their king, had all been asked to attend. Along with the king, the queen and her men, and the woe, and the little, to represent the mountain clans. He knelt down, as did some others, and offered their prayers, and then he watched as the king and queen walked their way. Ghost alongside them, alone with only one of Jon's 2 female cousins. 2 things were clear to Howland. Looking at the Stark girls, there was a divide between Jon Snow and Sansa Stark, and Arya Stark was Lyanna. Come again. It was something that Meiji most keenly picked up on, and he had seen the woman look to Arya wistfully more than once, as she had to Jon Snow also, truth be told. While he doubted she'd yet made the connection, he felt it was only a matter of time, and he hoped that when she did, she'd support him just as he was. Howland watched as Jon led his queen their way, and as the queen's hand tried his best not to glare at the king, making him wonder what the issue Tyrion Lannister had with Jon was. His Grace and I called you to speak because we wish to discuss something with you here in this sacred place, the queen said. Our enemy has one big advantage over us. As we fall, he grows stronger, Jon began. While I know better than any just how strong a women warrior can be, here in the north especially, not all women can be warriors. Not all men either. Yet, to the Night King, it matters not. Any who fall will rise again, and while in our army they may not offer much in the way of offense, in his they are as strong as any soldier of ours. The Night King doesn't need to defend those weakest amongst him. He doesn't care, as they will fight regardless. But we, my king and I, those of us here in this sacred place, we live and breathe and our hearts beat. We care, we will fight, and we will protect, and in doing so, we give him the advantage. Daenerys said, looking to Jon, What is it you ask of us, Dragon Queen? King Crow. Tormund asked, We need to gather those who cannot fight, those who are old ill, those not able to wield a weapon or who would need our protection the most in the battle to come. We need to gather them and send them south. Jon Snow said, You would have me send my granddaughters south, the Jon. The wall asked. I would the wall, granddaughters, daughters, sons, uncles, aunts, fathers, mothers, any who cannot bear arms need to be elsewhere when the army of the dead comes our way. I propose we send them under guard to the neck. They can be safe there while we face the Night King here without fear for their lives. While it's true, men may fight harder knowing their loved ones reside in these walls, we risk too much, should they fall behind us. Then we risk a fight on two fronts, and though I wish them safe, I also wish to remove the risk to our men also, Jon said. He looked at the others and saw them nod, Brianna shaking her head at something. Her mother said, and Arya glaring at her cousin as if daring him to tell her that she had to leave. When they had given their agreement, he heard Jon say something very strange, and he wondered where it came from. We'll hold a meeting in the Great Hall with the rest of the lords. Lord Wyman, when we're there, I'd ask you to suggest we march the people to White Harbor. That we suggest using Her Grace's ships to ferry them to Dragonstone, if need be. Jon said, looking to Wyman. Your Grace? Wyman asked, confused. Bear with me, my lord. Of course, Your Grace. He watched as Jon spoke to Daenerys and then left with Sir Davos as Tyrion Lannister. Then tried to speak to the Queen, only to be waved off for now. It took a few hours to organize the meeting in the Great Hall, and once it was done that they had gathered, Jon stood up to speak. Howland, looking around the room to see who raised the most objections about what he was about to say, My lords, my ladies, the army of the dead march our way, and soon we'll need to face them. Tomorrow the work begins in earnest to prepare Winterfell to defend against the Night King. However, before then there is something I need to see done. We needs must protect our people, and to do that we cannot leave our most vulnerable open to attack. Winterfell, despite its walls, is not best placed for their protection, and so we must send them south. You would have our people leave. We are Northmen, we belong in the north. I'll not send my wife and children away. The voices were loud, and Jon slammed his hand down on the table. Howland looking on as the room quietened, and then it was Lord Royce and Sansa Stark who spoke. Your Grace, we're of the north, we belong in the north. Surely we can find somewhere to protect our people. The crypts, we can secure them, and our people would be safe in there. Sansa said to Nods. Ah, Your Grace, my knights can see it, made secure. No one will get in, I give you my oath. Lord Royce added, And what about getting out, Lord Royce? Lady Stark, Daenerys said. Your Grace? Lord Royce asked, looking confused. We face an enemy who can raise the dead, Lord Royce, yet you and Lady Stark would have us hide in crypts with the dead. Tormund, pray tell, Lord Royce and the Lords of the North, what happened at Hardhome. Daenerys said, and Howland saw Jon's smirk as it briefly appeared on his face. After the dead came and killed my people. After Jon Snow killed a White Walker and saved as many as he could. After we made it to the boats and rowed for the ships and looked on as my people were massacred. After all of that, the icy fucker walked to the edge of the pier and raised his hands. He fucking raised his hands, and as one my people rose, their eyes no longer their own, their minds his to play with, and thousands of blue eyes stared at us from the shore. Tormund said, tears falling from his face, as he sat back down. The room hushed, men looking to each other and to the floor. Lord Royce sitting with a shocked expression on his face, and Sansa Starks glaring at the Queen and King. Still think it a good idea to hide in the crypts, Lady Stark. Daenerys said to silence as Jon smirked and looked to Wyman, giving him a nod. Your Grace, Your Grace. Wyman said, standing up, I suggest we move those unable to fight to White Harbor, and if need be on to Dragonstone. We can begin the march on the morrow, if Your Graces allow it. An excellent idea, Lord Wyman. All those in favor, Jon said, and a few yeas were shouted out. My king asked you, who is in favor? Daenerys asked, and the shouts were much louder. He found himself chuckling when he left the Great Hall. If his king's plan was to show up Sansa Stark, then he succeeded, and yet he felt that perhaps that was not his only plan. And there was more going on here that he didn't know. Winterfell 305 AC. Tyrion! He was being left out of things. Decisions were being made in the room without him, and that he was not the only one absent wasn't comforting at all. It was exactly as he had feared. That once they got together, they'd be the ones to decide, and he, as Hand, would be sidelined. Tyrion had offered to help with the preparations for the fight to come, and had been told he wasn't needed. Yemi, Tormund, Beric, and others were all asked to help prepare, and yet he was asked to attend to less pressing matters. Had he not beaten back Stannis? Prepared King's Landing for an attack they should have lost? Did he not plan his queen's strategy for taking Westeros? True, he'd suffered a few setbacks, but the Sand Snakes deserved what they got, and were they and the Greyjoys any use then? They'd have known better than to accept his sailing route. Of course, Euron would lie in wait if they went that way, only fools wouldn't know better. Tyrion hadn't wept when they'd fallen, and he'd not outright conspired with their enemies to see it done. He just made sure it had happened. Olenna and the Tyrells was a mistake. He'd been outplayed, his brother making a move that Tyrion hadn't been able to predict. But losses happened in war, and surely he couldn't be blamed for them all. Yet Jon Snow wished no part of his offered advice, neither on the field or off of it, and Tyrion grew angrier each day. It was bad enough he had to watch him slobber all over a woman he didn't deserve, but he also now had to bow and call him your grace, him a son of Tyrell Lannister calling a bastard his king. Were his father not dead then, he'd slap him silly. As it was, he probably looked down upon him with satisfied glee. This last bit, though, was the final straw. They'd said one thing in the Godswood and another in the Great Hall, and he'd been privy to neither. Once again, the decisions were made without his input, and so he'd wanted until Snow and the others had gone for their ride, and he'd practically demanded to speak to the Queen. He was even willing to risk her further displeasure, as he evidently already had provoked her some so far. Her Grace will see you now. Nisyendi said, and Tyrion walked into the room, his queen looking just as beautiful as ever, and he smiled when he saw her, though not when he saw the White Wolf by her side. "What is it?" Daenerys asked, her voice agitated. "Your Grace, these plans of Lord Snow's." "King Jon's, you mean," she said pointedly. "Forgive me, Your Grace. King Jon's. These plans of his, are you sure they're for the best?" he asked. "What makes you think they're his plans, Lord Tyrion?" "Your Grace? My husband and I discussed these things together. They are our plans," she said with a smile. He felt the annoyance he had entering the room begin to rise. This was it, exactly what he had feared, and now he had it clearly shown in her own words. "Your Grace, you appointed me your hand to help advise you. How can I advise if I'm left out of things?" "You advise at my pleasure, Lord Hand. You are not my only advisor, and none come before my husband." "Your Grace, this is what I feared. He's leading you astray." "You've begun to rely on his advice far too much," he said, shaking his head. "As opposed to yours." "You're mean," she replied, her anger clear. "You're listening to a northern savage, a bastard who knows naught of politics," he said, and realized he's gone too far. Much too late. "That northern savage is my husband. That northern savage brought me a kingdom when you lost me 3. That northern savage is your king," Daenerys said, standing up, the White Wolf doing likewise. "He's not my king. I never knelt to him. I knelt only to you," he said, and he flinched when he saw her face. "That's your entire problem, Lord Tyrion. You won't recognize my husband, and so you cannot serve me. How I need you to." Daenerys said, "Your Grace, when the people march south, you will go with them. I find I have no need of your advice for what's to come, Lord Tyrion. Now leave me before I find I've no need of you either. Your Grace, you're making a mistake, the bastard." "Enough," Daenerys said, walking towards him. "You will never speak of my husband that way again, never." She ripped the pin from his chest. "Your Grace, please," he asked, his voice almost breaking. "If you cannot accept my husband, cannot even treat him with the respect he deserves, then you are no longer my hand. Go south, Tyrion, and hope my ire doesn't follow you." Daenerys said, turning from him. He made a move to go to her, but the White Wolf moved towards him, making it clear what would happen if he took another step. Missandei then glared at him as she came running into the room, and Tyrion walked from the Queen's rooms in a daze. How long he walked for, he didn't know, but eventually he came to a door and knocked on it. "Tyrion," Sansa Stark said, smiling to see him. "We need to talk," he said as she opened the door wider to let him inside. Winterfell 305 AC. Aegon. When he had spoken to her about his plans to move people south, he found that she was in complete agreement. More so when he brought up his reasoning regarding the crypts. That she then suggest they use it against Sansa made him laugh. So much so that she, at first, got affronted, thinking he was suggesting she didn't understand the politics, when it was the complete opposite. "No, my love, I was laughing thinking of Sansa's face. Not at the idea." "So you don't think me foolish?" she asked. Still not completely sure he was telling the truth. "I had thought to use this for the reasons I wished." "You thought how to use this to undermine Sansa." I understand politics somewhat. You though have a feel for it that I don't possess. Aegon said, and she smiled at that. Then it's just as well my husband can wield a sword. You saw the spars? He asked, smiling. Oh, Aegon, my love, who's speaking of spars, she said, her voice low and husky. Whether it was her nature or the fact that she carried their babe, Aegon found he cared not that his wife wished to lay together as often as she did, was something he thanked the gods for, and no matter what else was on his mind, being with her in that way made the world disappear. You're doing it again, Tormund said, and he shook his head, glad now they were riding slowly rather than at full speed. Shut up, you crazy fucker, he said to last from those with him. Tormund, Davos, Ser Caime, Grey Worm, Kono, and Targaryen had ridden out to look over the ground ahead of them. He'd have brought others too, but they were needed back in Winterfell to both see over the keep's defenses and to organize the march south. Still, Aegon was happy enough with the men who were with him. It would be these mainly that he'd need for his plans anyway. The empty ground stretched out to the Wolf's Wood, and as he closed his eyes, Aegon could see the Dothrakis ride, their swords being extinguished, and one by one their greatest strength wasted uselessly. Kono, when your men charge, do you charge straight? He asked, and Kono looked at him and nodded. Dothraki, line up and charge. Khal. Would you ride from the side? Asked, and Kono looked at him. Axion climbing from his horse and picking up a stick. As he did, the others did the same, Lycan taking the stick and drawing Winterfell, showing a force of Unsullied lined up behind barriers and Kono shaking his head. This bad Qohor said, and Jaime Lannister asked the question that Aegon knew was on others' lips. Qohor, Jaime asked, confused. The 3,000 of Qohor. Aegon said, seeing a small smirk on Grey Worm's face. The Dothraki crashed against them and lost most of their Khalasar. It's why they respect the Unsullied so. The Fraki not ride against walls. Katsuno said simply. Aegon got the stick and began to draw a force attacking the Unsullied. He then drew crude horses coming in from either side and saw both Yume and Davos nod. Tormund looking a little upset as they remembered Stannis cutting through Mance's men. A double envelopment, Yane said, and Iakin nodded. Can the Khalasar do this, split in two, and attack from the sides? Aegon said, and Khalasar looked at the drawing in the mud and smiled, nodding eagerly. I need you to find ground where you can be hidden. Kochimo, here and here, he pointed to the sides. Do you use horns? He asked, and Kochimo shook his head. A dragon flying over you, letting out its flames? He asked, and Kono nodded. Then we ride? Kono asked. Then you ride, Aegon said. Full-on attacks were good when facing men buckled, their courage could falter. The dead weren't afraid, they had nothing left to lose, so why would they be worried? They'd fall. After speaking to Kono, they mounted the horses and rode to the Wolf's Wood. From there to Winterfell, covered a great distance, and yet the dead had come straight at them. Using the shortest, quickest route, he could use that, and he would, telling Tormund, Kono, and Davos to gather large sticks. He turned to Jaime Lannister, and they rode back from the trees. The two of them looking over the lands between Winterfell and here. How far? He asked, pointing the keep in the distance. 2 miles, 3, Jaime said, nodding. The dead aren't clever, Sir Jaime. They're not men, and they don't think among them are their commanders. White Walkers kill one, and any dead men he raised will fall. But before we get close to them, the dead will come, and they'll come hard. How do you stop a cavalry charge? That depends. Pikes, spears, and shields, caltrops, Jaime said. I intend to use all 3. They'll come at us from there and travel the shortest distance to there, he said, pointing from the trees to Winterfell. The ground between them and us will need to be prepared as if there were cavalry coming to attack us. Sergier, what if they see it? Jaime asked. They won't. Besides, we'll give them reason enough to keep coming straight, he said, and Jaime nodded. The Queen and I will soften the ground using the dragons. I need you to organize trenches, spread them out, so if they move around them, they fall in others. We'll use spikes, crude caltrops, anything we can to slow them down, and though we'll not take them all, we'll take some. Can you see it done? I can, Your Grace. Whatever he could do to limit the numbers that faced the Unsullied he would do. As for the men themselves, they would not be there to hold, but to lure, to bring them onto them, so the Dothraki could cut them down. He'd speak to Quano later, the Knights of the Vale too, envelop, ride, regroup, but never stay and engage. That's how cavalry fought. And though the Dothraki weren't Westerosi against these foes, that's what they needed to be. It was late when they returned to Winterfell. He was tired, hungry, and wanted nothing more but to go and be with his wife. Aegon felt they had done well today, and soon he'd begin to limit the numbers facing them even more. For now, though, he wished to pray, and so he bid the others farewell, and walked alone to the Godswood, taking a knee and reaching out to touch the tree once he reached it. The man was old and gray. His scarred face bore the sign of battles many years earlier, his wrinkled fingers feeling the scar over his eye. The sword he'd carried for almost 50 years was now in the hands of a much younger man. Jon Snow had no need for it where he was going. Over the years, he'd become wiser than he had ever been, realized things he'd never known, and nursed a heart that he'd broken in two. "You know nothing, Jon Snow." Jornir had been right. He'd known nothing. And because of that, he'd killed the woman he loved. All his life, he'd done things for other people's reasons, never for his. And what had it got him? Nothing. Nothing at all. A life alone at the edge of the world, a heart that had never healed from what he had done, and an abandonment of friends, family, and even the gods themselves. Cursed is the kinslayer, and that's what he had become. A kinslayer, and it was his curse to bear. A Targaryen alone in the world is a terrible thing. He had left her alone, and what she had done was a terrible thing. Yet now, here in this place, he felt the words that Aemon had said referred more to him than they ever did to Daenerys. She had been alone because he had left her that way. He was alone because he killed the only true family he ever had. Jon felt the tears fall as he knelt in the snow. As he thought about the life he had thrown away, he began to weep. He'd killed her for his family to save Sansa area, and they'd sent him here to rot. Not once in 50 years had either of them come looking for him. No letters had been sent, and though Tormund had occasionally gone to Castle Black before he passed, not once had there been so much as a raven's scroll to ask after their so-called brother. The truth of the matter was they had never truly seen him as such, though at least in Arya's case he had found out that she had never returned to Westeros. The Corstark man who'd told him that so many years earlier was a grandson of Alice, and she was the one person in the north who had ever cared to ask after him. He made it to the great weirwood and looked around for the branches to build a fire. In truth, he had no need of one, and it would not last till the morrow. But then again, neither would he. Lighting it, he sat down and stared into the flames and saw them all. The people he'd helped save and those who abandoned him. Sam, Tyrion, Sansa, Bran. There were others true. Davos, though, he held no true blame for him. He'd never told him his truth, after all, and Arya, though she had played her part, he had loved her once. And the girl she'd been had died long before they met, once more. Jon preferring to remember the one he'd said goodbye to at Winterfell before he headed for the Wall than whoever that one he'd met in the Godswood in Winterfell was. The twig broke under his fingers as he thought of the Wall and his time there. His uncle, who he'd not known, was his kin. Benjen, who'd always been true. Jackshire, Mormont, who'd gifted him so much, and Ed, Green, and Pipe. His true friends. Yet he should never have been there, and he cursed the man who'd let him go. The man who'd let him believe in yet another lie. He had not been a bastard, and the Night's Watch was not full of honorable men. But then again, what did Ned Stark know of honor? As he looked into the flames, though it was deep, violet eyes he saw, there was love, pain, and heartbreak in them. And he found he couldn't look anymore. Jon kicked the snow over the fire and watched it go out before taking a charred branch from it and stood up, moving to the weirwood. He began to write his name using the soot. What year it was he knew not. Was he 75 or older? He couldn't remember. Not that it mattered much anyway, as he wrote his name and last words on the tree. Jon sat back down and looked at. He was happy enough that it covered the truth, and he closed his eyes and saw hers once more. Aegon opened his eyes, wondering why they'd shown it to him again, and almost expecting to see the words written on the tree. Aegon Targaryen, the man who killed the woman he loved. That was the last thing he'd ever written. The last thing they'd shown him before they'd shown him the truth. No, before he'd lived it. That's what it had felt like. What he'd had experienced. A life in moments, and it had broken and rebuilt him all at once. It had lit a fire in him that burned ever more brightly each day. Deuteronomy, his love, his wife, his life, she and their babe, they were all that mattered. The only truth he needed to know. Wolves were a pack, but dragons were solitary. That's what the books had said. Yet they were wrong. Dragons were family. True family, and Aegon had learned the difference over time. I've lived as a wolf. I swear here and now, when I die, it'll be as a dragon, he said as he rose to his feet and turned to head back to his family.